Some places refuse to let you find your way. Logan Pass sits at the heart of Glacier National Park. Like a gateway between worlds, its windswept meadows and jagged peaks, drawing nearly 500,000 visitors each year along the Going to the Sun Road. At 6,646 feet above sea level, the pass serves as the continental divide, where waters split their ancient paths toward the Pacific and Atlantic. For most travelers, it represents nothing more than a stunning photo opportunity and a chance to stretch their legs before the winding descent. But for 17 different groups of hikers during the summer of 1987, Logan Pass became the place where navigation itself seemed to break down. The Hidden Lake Overlook Trail begins innocuously enough from the Logan Pass Visitor Center, a paved pathway that transforms into boardwalk as it winds through alpine meadows toward one of the park's most photographed vistas. The trail spans roughly 3 miles round trip, classified as easy to moderate, suitable for families and casual hikers. Park records indicate that over 40,000 people complete this hike annually without incident. The path itself follows well-established routes, first mapped by government surveyors in 1910, when the area was designated as the nation's 10th national park. Yet something about this particular stretch of the Continental Divide has always felt different to those who pay attention to such things. The Blackfeet tribe, whose ancestral lands encompass the eastern slopes of what is now Glacier National Park, traditionally avoided camping in the immediate vicinity of Logan Pass, though tribal historians are reluctant to discuss specific reasons. Early park rangers noted in their logs that wildlife patterns seemed inconsistent in the area, with elk and bighorn sheep often appearing disoriented when crossing the pass. One 1934 incident report describes a small herd of mountain goats found standing in a perfect circle near the trail, apparently healthy but unresponsive to approaching rangers until physically touched. The events of 1987 began on June 14th when a family from Minneapolis reported to park rangers that their compass had begun spinning uncontrollably, approximately 1.5 miles up the Hidden Lake Overlook Trail. David Chen, the father and an experienced backpacker, initially assumed the instrument was defective, until his backup compass exhibited identical behavior at the same location. The family marked the spot with a cairn of rocks and continued their hike, noting that both compasses resumed normal function within 50 yards of continuing up the trail. 3 days later, a group of geology students from the University of Montana encountered the same phenomenon at what appeared to be identical coordinates. Sarah Martinez, the group leader, documented the incident in her field journal with precise GPS readings: 48 degrees, 41 minutes, 57 seconds north latitude, 113 degrees, 43 minutes, 12 seconds west longitude. Martinez noted that all 4 compasses in their possession spun wildly for approximately 6 minutes before simultaneously settling into normal magnetic declination. More disturbing was her observation that the spinning occurred in perfect synchronization across all instruments. By late July, reports were arriving at the park's administrative offices with troubling regularity. A family from Denver, 2 separate groups of day hikers from Calgary, a retired surveyor from Billings who had worked with magnetic instruments for over 30 years and insisted he had never witnessed such behavior outside of areas with documented magnetic anomalies. Each report described the same basic phenomenon: compasses spinning uncontrollably at the same coordinates, always between 3:17 and 3:23 in the afternoon, always lasting between 4 and 8 minutes. Park Ranger Elizabeth Kowalski began documenting these incidents in an unofficial log after the 8th reported case. "At first we thought it might be equipment failure or user error," she later recalled in a phone interview. But when you have experienced hikers, people with military navigation training, geologists with professional-grade instruments, all reporting identical compass behavior at the same specific location, you start to take notice. Kowalski's supervisor, Chief Ranger Robert Hawkins, was less inclined toward speculation. According to internal park communications, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, Hawkins initially attributed the reports to seasonal electromagnetic fluctuations and recommended no formal investigation. However, by August 15th, with 17 separate incident reports filed, Hawkins contacted the United States Geological Survey to request an informal assessment. The USGS response, dated August 22, 1987, stated that no known magnetic anomalies existed in the Logan Pass area and that the phenomenon described in the reports fell outside normal parameters for geomagnetic disturbance. The letter, signed by Dr. Margaret Thornfield of the Geomagnetism Program, recommended that the Park Service conduct its own investigation using calibrated magnetometer equipment. Dr. Thornfield also noted that similar reports had never been documented in any other location within the national park system. What happened next remains unclear from available documentation. Park Service records indicate that a routine trail assessment was conducted in early September 1987, but no details of this assessment appear in publicly available files. The only reference to any investigation appears in a maintenance log entry dated September 12, noting that trail markers require repositioning due to geological considerations. No geological survey report exists in park archives. On September 28, 1987, new trail markers appeared along the Hidden Lake Overlook Trail, routing hikers approximately 200 yards east of the original path through a section that required significantly more elevation gain. Park literature described the change as an improvement designed to provide enhanced wildlife viewing opportunities and reduced environmental impact. The old section of trail was not officially closed, but was allowed to somewhat become overgrown through lack of maintenance. Dr. James Morrison, a physics professor at Montana State University, who had been following the reports through local media coverage, attempted to obtain permission to conduct magnetometer readings at the original coordinates in October 1987. His request was denied by the Park Service on grounds that the area had been temporarily closed for habitat restoration. Morrison's subsequent Freedom of Information Act request for documentation related to this closure was returned with the notation that no responsive records were located. The rerouted trail has remained in use since 1988, with no subsequent reports of compass anomalies. However, GPS coordinates taken at the original location continue to produce interesting results. In 1994, a group of amateur radio operators reported receiving unusual electromagnetic signatures when conducting a routine propagation test near Logan Pass. Their equipment detected what they described as a standing wave pattern that remained consistent across multiple frequency bands, but only at specific times of day. More recently, hikers using smartphone GPS applications have reported brief but consistent signal acquisition errors when attempting to navigate near the original trail coordinates. These errors appear to occur most frequently during the same afternoon hours when compass anomalies were originally documented. Apple and Google have not responded to requests for comment regarding GPS accuracy in the Logan Pass area. The old trail section remains visible to those who know where to look, marked now only by the occasional weathered bootprint in soil that seems reluctant to support new vegetation. Park rangers continue to direct visitors along the newer route without explanation, and Logan Pass maintains its reputation as one of Glacier National Park's most accessible and spectacular destinations. Yet some questions resist the comfort of official explanations. 17 separate groups of hikers, using different equipment during different weather conditions, over the course of 4 months, all reported identical compass behavior at identical coordinates during identical time windows. No geological survey was ever conducted. No magnetometer readings were ever taken. No scientific investigation was ever completed. The coordinates remain on maps, precise as they were in 1987. The compasses that spun there are still spinning somewhere, pointing towards something that officially doesn't exist. in a place the trail no longer goes. There are places on government maps that refuse to stay mapped. The Little Rocky Mountains rise from the northern Montana plains like ancient bones breaking through prairie skin, their weathered peaks barely reaching 4,000 feet above sea level, yet commanding a presence that dwarfs their modest elevation. This isolated range sits entirely within the boundaries of the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, home to the Gros Ventre and Assiniboine tribes, whose ancestors have moved through these hills for countless generations. The mountains contain some of the richest gold deposits ever discovered in Montana, veins that brought prospectors and mining companies in waves during the late 1800s. Though most outside interest had faded by the 1920s, Lodgepole Creek winds through the southeastern foothills of the range, fed by seasonal snowmelt and underground springs that maintain a steady flow even during drought years. The creek follows an ancient path between low ridges covered in ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, creating a natural corridor that early travelers found ideal for temporary camps. Tribal histories speak of this area as a traditional gathering place, where different bands would meet during summer months to trade, arrange marriages, and share news from distant territories. The creek provided reliable water, the surrounding hills offered shelter from prairie winds, and game remained plentiful even during harsh winters. By the early 1900s, several permanent homesteads had been established along Lodgepole Creek by tribal members who had accepted individual land allotments under the Dawes Act. These families built log cabins, planted gardens, and raised cattle on the rich bottomland. Bureau of Indian Affairs records from this period describe a small but stable community that had grown to include a one-room schoolhouse, a trading post, and even a modest church served by a visiting Methodist minister who made monthly rounds through the reservation. The first documented anomaly occurred in 1889, according to tribal oral histories recorded in the 1930s by ethnographer Dr. Margaret Wheeler. Gros Ventre elder Joseph Standing Bear told Wheeler that his grandfather had described a settlement along Lodgepole Creek that went away when the government men came to count it. Standing Bear's account, preserved in Wheeler's field notes at the University of Montana archives, describes a community of mixed-blood families who had built substantial homes and cleared significant acreage for farming. When territorial surveyors arrived to map the area for the newly established reservation, they found only empty land, with no evidence that anyone had ever lived there. The more recent incident began with routine paperwork. In March 1952, Bureau of Indian Affairs agent Robert Caldwell submitted his annual census report for the Fort Belknap Reservation, documenting a population increase in the Lodgepole Creek area. Caldwell's report, filed with the BIA office in Billings, listed 43 families comprising 167 individuals living in permanent structures along a 4-mile stretch of the creek. The report included detailed information about livestock numbers, crop yields, and requests for additional funding to expand the local school, which had outgrown its single room. Caldwell had worked on the reservation for 8 years and was known for his meticulous record-keeping. His 1952 report contained hand-drawn maps showing the location of individual homesteads, complete with family names and property boundaries. He noted that the community had grown significantly since his previous visit in October 1951, when he had counted only 12 families in the area. Several new arrivals had come from other parts of the reservation, drawn by reports of good grazing land and reliable water rights. The discrepancy came to light in April 1953, when a team of government surveyors arrived to update official boundary maps for the reservation. The survey crew, led by Thomas Mitchell from the Bureau of Land Management, was tasked with verifying property lines and documenting any new development that might affect future resource management decisions. Mitchell's team expected to spend several days mapping the Lodgepole Creek settlement based on Caldwell's detailed reports from the previous year. Instead, they found empty grassland. Mitchell's official survey report, dated April 28, 1953, describes finding no evidence of current or recent habitation along Lodgepole Creek. The survey team used Caldwell's hand-drawn maps to navigate to the exact coordinates where homes and farms had been documented just 13 months earlier. They found undisturbed prairie, with no foundations, no cleared fields, no fencing, and no indication that the land had ever been modified for human use. Even more puzzling, the soil showed no signs of recent disturbance. Areas where Caldwell had mapped gardens and corrals contained native grasses that appeared to have been growing undisturbed for decades. The Bureau of Indian Affairs launched a quiet investigation into the discrepancy in May 1953. Supervisor James Hoffman traveled from Billings to interview Caldwell, who insisted that his reports were accurate and offered to guide investigators to the settlement he had documented. Caldwell led the investigation team to Lodgepole Creek on May 15, 1953, following the same route he had used for years. According to Hoffman's confidential memo to BIA headquarters, Caldwell became increasingly agitated as they approached the creek, repeatedly checking his compass and consulting his field notes. When they reached the coordinates where Caldwell had mapped the largest cluster of homes, they found only an empty meadow surrounded by unbroken forest. The investigation expanded to include interviews with tribal members from other parts of the reservation. Several people confirmed that families had indeed moved to the Lodgepole Creek area during 1951 and early 1952. Mary Crow Dog, who lived near the agency headquarters, told investigators that her cousin had relocated to Lodgepole Creek with his wife and 4 children in September 1951. She had received letters from the family describing their new home and their plans to plant wheat the following spring. The letters had stopped arriving in February 1953. Other witnesses provided similar accounts. Thomas Littlehawk, who operated a small store near the reservation's eastern boundary, recalled selling supplies to Lodgepole Creek residents throughout 1952. His records showed regular transactions with families whose names matched those in Caldwell's census report. Littlehawk had last seen several of these customers in January 1953, when they had purchased seed for spring planting. When investigators asked if he had worried about their sudden absence from his store, Littlehawk replied that some people just move on, but admitted that the simultaneous disappearance of all his Lodgepole Creek customers had struck him as unusual. The investigation took an unexpected turn when researchers discovered Dr. Wheeler's 1930s ethnographic notes containing Joseph Standing Bear's account of the 1889 incident. The parallels were unmistakable. A thriving settlement along Lodgepole Creek, documented by government officials, vanishing completely when formal surveys were conducted. BIA Supervisor Hoffman noted in his final report that historical precedent suggests this may not be an isolated incident, but stopped short of offering any explanation for how entire communities could disappear without trace. The matter was quietly closed in September 1953, with no further investigation authorized. Robert Caldwell requested transfer to a different assignment and was relocated to the Crow Reservation in October. His subsequent BIA career was unremarkable, though colleagues noted that he never again submitted reports containing population estimates for areas he had not personally visited within the previous 30 days. Thomas Mitchell continued his surveying career for another 15 years, but former associates recall that he rarely discussed his work on the Fort Belknap Reservation and typically changed the subject when asked about unusual incidents he had encountered. Modern satellite imagery of the Lodgepole Creek area shows the same undisturbed grassland that Mitchell's survey team documented in 1953. No archaeological survey has ever been conducted at the site, despite its potential significance for understanding reservation-era settlement patterns. The Bureau of Indian Affairs maintains that no funding exists for investigating historical mapping discrepancies, and the Tribal Council has not requested federal assistance for exploring the area. Local tribal members continue to avoid the Lodgepole Creek corridor, though few are willing to discuss their reasons with outsiders. The area remains accessible by foot or horseback, but visitors report an unusual quality to the silence there, as if the landscape itself is holding its breath. Some hikers describe feeling watched, though they never see anyone else in the vicinity. The creek still flows, as it always has, following its ancient path between the hills, carrying snowmelt and groundwater toward the Milk River. Along its banks, native grasses grow thick and undisturbed, covering ground that once may have supported homes, schools, and dreams of families who believed they had found a place to stay. Whether they ever existed beyond government documents and fading memories remains a question that no amount of surveying seems able to answer. Some silences arrive on schedule. Freeze-Out Lake sprawls across 12,000 acres of preserved wetland in north-central Montana, 40 miles south of the Canadian border along the western edge of the northern Great Plains. The lake serves as a critical stopover point for waterfowl, traveling the Central Flyway, hosting over 300,000 birds during peak migration periods each spring and fall. Established as a wildlife management area in 1957, the site encompasses not just the lake itself, but surrounding grasslands, seasonal ponds, and managed farming units designed to provide food sources for migrating birds. The landscape here feels deliberately vast, engineered by glacial forces that carved shallow basins and left behind rich soils, perfect for both agriculture and wildlife habitat. The lake rarely exceeds 4 feet in depth, making it ideal for diving ducks and dabbling species that feed on aquatic vegetation and invertebrates. During winter months, much of the lake freezes solid, earning it the name that locals have used since the 1880s when cattle ranchers first settled the area. Freeze-Out Lake sits at the intersection of 2 major transportation corridors that have shaped Montana's development for over a century. Highway 89 runs north-south along the lake's eastern shore, connecting Great Falls to the Canadian border crossing at Sweetgrass. To the west, the abandoned right-of-way of the Great Northern Railway parallels the shoreline. Though passenger service ended in 1979 and freight trains stopped running this route entirely by 1985, the combination of highway access and railway infrastructure made the area attractive to federal wildlife managers seeking to establish a major waterfowl management facility. The first documented radio interference occurred on March 22, 1974, when Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks biologist Dr. Janet Morrison was conducting a pre-migration survey of nesting habitat around the lake. Morrison was using a handheld radio to maintain contact with her research partner, who was conducting simultaneous observations from the opposite shore of the lake. At exactly 4:44 p.m., according to Morrison's field notes, both radios simultaneously cut to static that lasted precisely 6 minutes before normal communication resumed. Morrison initially attributed the interference to atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunction, but the phenomenon repeated at the same time the following day. Her field journal, archived at Montana State University, documents identical radio blackouts occurring at 4:44 p.m. on 7 consecutive days during her survey period. Morrison noted that the interference affected multiple radio frequencies and appeared to impact all electronic communication devices within approximately 2 miles of the lake's center coordinates. More puzzling was Morrison's discovery that the same interference pattern occurred each morning at 4:44 a.m., though she only documented this timing by accident when an equipment alarm woke her during an overnight observation session. The pre-dawn blackout lasted exactly 6 minutes, matching the evening phenomenon in both duration and intensity. Morrison's attempts to measure the precise geographic boundaries of the interference zone produced consistent results. Radio communications functioned normally beyond a 2-mile radius from the lake's geographic center, but failed completely within that boundary during the twice-daily windows. Dr. Morrison reported her findings to the regional wildlife manager, who forwarded her documentation to the Federal Communications Commission in June 1974. The FCC's initial response, dated July 15th, acknowledged receipt of the complaint and indicated that a field investigation would be scheduled when resources become available. No such investigation appears to have been conducted, and follow-up inquiries from Morrison went unanswered. Local ranchers began reporting similar radio problems throughout the mid-1970s. Carl Zimmerman, whose ranch borders the wildlife area's southern boundary, filed formal complaints with the FCC in 1976, 1978, and 1981, documenting how the interference disrupted his ability to coordinate cattle operations during the critical twice-daily periods. It was like someone threw a switch, Zimmerman recalled in a 1998 interview with the Great Falls Tribune. Every day, 4:44 in the morning and 4:44 in the evening, every radio within miles would just go dead. You could set your watch by it. The phenomenon affected more than just ranching operations. Highway patrol officers reported that their mobile radios became unreliable when responding to incidents along Highway 89 near the lake. Emergency medical services documented communication blackouts that complicated response times for accidents occurring during the interference windows. By 1982, the Teton County Sheriff's Department had established a policy requiring deputies to schedule non-emergency patrols around the twice-daily radio blackouts. Dr. Morrison continued documenting the phenomenon throughout her career at Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, which lasted until her retirement in 1995. Her research files contain over 20 years of consistent observations, showing that the interference pattern never varied from its precise 4:44 timing. Weather conditions, seasonal changes, solar activity, and migration patterns had no apparent effect on the radio blackouts. Morrison's data indicated that the phenomenon occurred every single day, including holidays, weekends, and during severe winter storms when the lake was completely frozen. The timing itself became a source of local folklore. 4:44 corresponded to no known natural cycle, no astronomical event, and no historical significance related to the area. Some residents began referring to the daily blackouts as the silence, while others simply adjusted their schedules to avoid important radio communications during those 12-minute daily windows. Local businesses that relied on radio coordination learned to plan around the interference, treating it as an unchangeable fact of geography rather than a technical problem requiring solution. In 1987, Dr. Richard Chen from the University of Montana's Physics Department attempted to study the radio interference as part of a broader research project on electromagnetic anomalies in the Northern Rockies. Chen's funding proposal to the National Science Foundation requested resources to install permanent monitoring equipment around Freeze-Out Lake and conduct systematic analysis of the interference pattern. The proposal was rejected without review, with NSF administrators noting that the described phenomenon falls outside current research priorities. Chen proceeded with a smaller-scale investigation using university resources, setting up temporary monitoring stations around the lake during spring migration season in 1988. His preliminary data confirmed Morrison's observations. All radio frequencies within the 2-mile radius experienced complete signal loss during the specified time windows. More intriguingly, Chen's equipment detected what he described as structured electromagnetic patterns during the blackout periods, suggesting that the silence was not simply an absence of signal, but rather the presence of something that overwhelmed normal radio transmission. Chen's research was cut short when university administrators informed him that his monitoring activities required permits from multiple federal agencies, including the FCC, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Department of Interior. The permit application process, Chen discovered, could take up to 2 years and required detailed justification for research activities near sensitive wildlife habitat. Chen's subsequent attempts to obtain the necessary permits were unsuccessful, and his research files from the Freeze-Out Lake project were transferred to university archives with restricted access in 1990. The Federal Communications Commission's response to decades of complaints about Freeze-Out Lake remains consistent. No record exists of any investigation into radio interference in the area, and no technical explanation has been provided for the reported phenomena. FCC spokespersons contacted by journalists have indicated that interference complaints are handled through normal regulatory channels, but no documentation of such handling appears in publicly available records. Modern digital communications equipment exhibits the same interference patterns that affected analog radio systems in the 1970s. Cell phone service drops completely within the 2-mile radius during the twice-daily windows. GPS systems lose satellite lock, and emergency services personnel continue to work around the predictable communication blackouts. The phenomenon has remained unchanged for over 50 years, occurring with mechanical precision regardless of technological advances in radio and digital communications. Wildlife continues to use Freeze-Out Lake as intended, with migration patterns and bird populations showing no correlation to the radio interference timing. The lake fulfills its conservation mission successfully, hosting record numbers of waterfowl during recent migration seasons. Visitors who arrive outside the interference windows find normal cell phone coverage and clear radio reception. The silence affects only human technology, and only during those 12 specific minutes each day. At 4:44 each morning and evening, the electromagnetic spectrum around Freeze-Out Lake becomes a place where human voices cannot travel, where emergency calls cannot be placed, and where the modern world briefly loses its ability to speak across distance. The silence arrives without warning and leaves without explanation, as reliable as sunrise and as mysterious as the sky itself. Some journeys leave marks that refuse to fade. The Beartooth Highway stretches 68 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the American West, connecting Red Lodge, Montana to the northeast entrance of Yellowstone National Park, via a serpentine route that climbs to nearly 11,000 feet above sea level. Designated as U.S. Highway 212, this seasonal road typically opens in late May and closes with the first heavy snows of October, when sustained winds and blizzard conditions make travel impossible even for the most experienced mountain drivers. The highway crosses the Beartooth Plateau, a vast expanse of alpine tundra punctuated by glacial lakes and granite peaks that remain snow-covered for 10 months of the year. Red Lodge Mountain Pass, located at mile marker 47 of the highway, represents one of the route's most challenging sections. The pass sits at 10,476 feet elevation, where the road curves sharply through a gap between towering peaks that funnel wind at sustained speeds, often exceeding 60 miles per hour. Weather conditions at this elevation can shift from clear skies to whiteout blizzards within minutes, creating hazards that have claimed dozens of vehicles and several lives since the highway opened to public traffic in 1936. The Montana Department of Transportation maintains detailed records of road conditions along the Beartooth Highway due to its notorious weather patterns and the critical importance of timing seasonal closures correctly. Snow removal crews begin monitoring the pass in early September, documenting snowfall patterns, wind speeds, and temperature fluctuations that determine when the highway becomes impassable. These crews have worked the same route for decades, developing an intimate familiarity with every curve, elevation change, and weather pattern along the 68-mile corridor. The first documented sighting occurred on October 15, 1963, when Montana DOT Supervisor Frank Morrison and his crew arrived at Red Lodge Mountain Pass to begin pre-winter road assessment. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, depositing approximately 4 inches of powder across the roadway and surrounding terrain. Morrison's crew was preparing to photograph road conditions for official documentation when equipment operator Ray Sullivan noticed an unusual set of tracks leading from the highway shoulder directly uphill toward the mountain summit. The tracks appeared to be human footprints, size 9 based on Sullivan's estimation, pressed cleanly into the fresh snow with remarkable clarity and depth. What struck Sullivan as immediately wrong was their direction. The prints led straight uphill from the road into terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers under ideal conditions. More disturbing was their apparent freshness. The snow had stopped falling at approximately 2 a.m., according to weather station data. Yet the tracks showed no signs of wind fill or deterioration, despite sustained gusts that had been measured at over 50 miles per hour since dawn. Morrison's crew followed the tracks for approximately 200 yards uphill from the highway, documenting their progress with standard departmental cameras. The footprints maintained consistent spacing and depth throughout their ascent, showing no signs of hesitation, sliding, or the shortened stride pattern, typical of someone struggling against steep terrain and high winds. At treeline, roughly 600 yards from the highway, and 400 feet higher in elevation, the tracks simply ended with no evidence of where their maker had gone. The crew's photographs, filed with the Montana DOT Regional Office in Billings, clearly showed the track pattern leading uphill through increasingly challenging terrain. Each footprint measured approximately 11 inches in length and appeared to have been made by someone walking barefoot or wearing very thin-soled shoes, inadequate for mountain conditions. The spacing between prints suggested a normal walking pace, rather than the careful, measured steps of someone navigating difficult terrain in severe weather. Morrison reported the incident to the Carbon County Sheriff's Department, suspecting that someone might be lost or stranded on the mountain. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the pass within 3 hours and confirmed the presence of the tracks, but a search of the area revealed no signs of human presence beyond the mysterious footprints. No abandoned vehicles were found in the vicinity, no distress signals had been reported, and no missing person reports matched the time frame of the incident. The following year, Morrison's crew returned to Red Lodge Mountain Pass for their annual October assessment. On October 15, 1964, they found identical tracks in fresh snow, following the exact same route uphill from the highway shoulder to treeline. The prints were the same size, showed the same depth and clarity, and ended at precisely the same location where the previous year's tracks had vanished. Morrison photographed the new tracks and compared them to the previous year's documentation, finding no discernible differences in size, spacing, or trajectory. By October 15, 1966, the annual appearance of the tracks had become an expected part of the crew's documentation routine. Morrison began maintaining a separate file for what department records referred to as anomalous track sightings, though no official investigation was ever initiated. The tracks appeared every year on the same date, regardless of weather conditions, snowfall timing, or wind patterns. Years when snow arrived early or late made no difference. The tracks were always there on October 15th morning when crews arrived to assess road conditions. Montana State Trooper Dennis Kowalski began documenting the phenomenon in 1972 after Morrison contacted state law enforcement about the recurring incidents. Kowalski's reports, filed annually for over 15 years, noted several consistent details that defied logical explanation. The tracks always appeared overnight between October 14th and 15th, regardless of when snow had fallen. They were always perfectly preserved despite wind conditions that should have obscured them within hours. Most puzzling, the tracks never showed the irregular patterns typical of someone walking in deep snow or struggling against severe wind. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Montana, examined photographs of the tracks in 1978 at the request of the Carbon County Sheriff's Department. Chen's analysis confirmed that the prints showed characteristics consistent with a human foot, but noted several anomalies that troubled her scientific training. The depth and clarity of the impressions suggested someone weighing approximately 160 pounds, yet the lack of heel slide or toe drag patterns indicated impossible stability given the terrain and weather conditions. More disturbing to Chen was the complete absence of accompanying evidence. Normal foot traffic in snow leaves additional marks. Scuff patterns where feet slip slightly. Deeper impressions where weight shifts for balance. Disturbed snow around the primary tracks where someone struggles to maintain footing. The Red Lodge Mountain Pass tracks showed none of these secondary indicators, appearing instead as if they had been pressed into the snow by someone walking on perfectly flat, stable ground. The Montana Department of Transportation quietly ceased photographing the annual tracks in 1982, though crews continued to report their presence each October 15th. Internal DOT memos obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests show that department administrators were concerned about public misinterpretation of routine documentation and preferred to handle the matter with minimal publicity. No explanation was provided for how tracks appearing in the same location for 20 consecutive years could be considered routine. State Trooper Kowalski's final report on the phenomenon, filed in 1987 before his retirement, noted that the tracks had appeared without fail for 25 consecutive years. His documentation included weather data, wind measurements, and temperature readings that consistently showed conditions too severe for unprotected human survival, yet the tracks persisted each year with mechanical regularity. Kowalski's replacement was not briefed on the annual phenomenon, and subsequent law enforcement reports make no mention of unusual track sightings at Red Lodge Mountain Pass. Local mountaineering groups began avoiding the area around October 15th after word of the tracks spread through informal channels in the 1980s. Experienced climbers reported feeling unsettled by the terrain near treeline, though none could articulate specific reasons for their discomfort. Some described the sensation of being followed while ascending toward the summit, despite visual confirmation that no one else was present on the mountain. Modern hikers occasionally report finding unusual tracks in the area, though none have been officially documented since the 1980s. The Beartooth Highway remains one of Montana's most challenging and spectacular routes, attracting thousands of visitors each summer who have no knowledge of the annual October phenomenon. The road still closes each winter when conditions become impassable, and snow removal crews still conduct their assessments each spring and fall. Yet somewhere in the files of the Montana Department of Transportation, 25 years of photographs document the same impossible journey. Size 9 footprints, walking uphill through howling wind and deep snow, leading toward a summit that offers no shelter, no destination, and no answers. The tracks continue their annual ascent, marking a path that someone or something has been walking for over 60 years. Always on the same date, always in the same direction, always toward a place that has no name, and offers no explanation for why anyone would choose to go there. Some boundaries refuse to stay where they are drawn. The Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge encompasses over 1 million acres of preserved prairie and badlands in north-central Montana, making it the largest wildlife refuge in the contiguous United States. Established in 1936 along the Missouri River, the refuge protects a vast expanse of mixed-grass prairie, riparian forests, and rugged breaks that shelter elk, bighorn sheep, and over 200 bird species. The landscape here represents what much of the Great Plains looked like before European settlement, with rolling grasslands stretching to horizons, broken only by occasional sandstone formations and the meandering course of the Missouri River. The refuge's remote location and massive scale have always presented challenges for federal land managers tasked with maintaining accurate boundary surveys and monitoring grazing permits on the approximately 300,000 acres leased to local ranchers. The Bureau of Land Management conducts periodic surveys to verify property lines, update grazing allotments, and document any changes in land use that might affect wildlife habitat or public access. These surveys require placing temporary markers throughout the refuge, often in areas so isolated that surveyors may be the only humans to visit specific locations for years at a time. The terrain itself complicates standard surveying procedures. The Missouri Breaks, a series of deeply carved coulées and sandstone bluffs along the river, create a landscape where traditional grid-based survey methods must adapt to topographic realities. Erosion constantly reshapes the Badlands. Seasonal flooding alters river boundaries, and the sheer distances involved mean that survey crews often work for weeks in areas with no road access, relying on all-terrain vehicles and occasionally helicopters to reach remote sections of the refuge. The first anomaly was discovered on September 23, 1991, when Bureau of Land Management surveyor Michael Brennan returned to check GPS coordinates he had marked 3 days earlier in the northern section of the refuge. Brennan had placed 12 survey stakes in a straight line across approximately 2 miles of prairie, following standard procedures for establishing a baseline measurement for updating grazing boundary maps. Each stake had been driven 18 inches into the ground, using a pneumatic hammer, and marked with fluorescent tape for easy visibility. When Brennan returned to collect his equipment, he found that all 12 stakes had been repositioned overnight. Rather than maintaining their original straight-line configuration, the stakes now formed a perfect hexagon, with sides measuring exactly 300 feet. The precision of the repositioning troubled Brennan, more than the fact that someone had apparently moved heavy surveying equipment across miles of difficult terrain without leaving tracks or other evidence of their presence. Brennan documented the altered stake positions with photographs and GPS measurements, noting that whoever had moved the stakes possessed sophisticated knowledge of geometric principles and surveying techniques. The hexagon was mathematically perfect, with angles and distances that would require professional equipment and considerable expertise to achieve. More puzzling was the fact that each stake had been driven to exactly the same depth as Brennan's original placement, suggesting the use of pneumatic tools identical to those employed by professional survey crews. The incident report Brennan filed with the BLM regional office in Billings described the repositioning as inconsistent with known wildlife behavior, weather patterns, or unauthorized human activity. Brennan noted that no vehicle tracks, footprints, or tool marks were visible in the surrounding area, despite soft soil conditions that should have preserved clear evidence of any human presence. The stakes themselves showed no signs of damage or hasty relocation, appearing instead as if they had been carefully surveyed into their new positions by experienced professionals. 3 weeks later, Brennan returned to the refuge to continue his boundary survey work, placing 15 stakes across a different section of prairie, approximately 12 miles from the original site. On October 18, 1991, he discovered that these stakes had also been repositioned overnight, this time forming a complex spiral pattern that corresponded to mathematical sequences Brennan did not recognize. Each stake occupied a position that appeared to be precisely calculated according to some underlying formula, with distances between markers following a pattern that increased by consistent mathematical progressions. Dr. Robert Chen, a mathematics professor at Montana State University who examined Brennan's photographs and measurements, identified the spiral pattern as corresponding to a Fibonacci sequence translated into geographic coordinates. The positioning showed a level of mathematical sophistication that Chen described as graduate-level understanding of applied geometry, requiring both theoretical knowledge and practical surveying skills that few individuals outside of professional engineering firms would possess. Brennan's supervisor, BLM District Manager Patricia Rodriguez, initially suspected that the incidents represented pranks by local college students or interference from anti-government activists protesting federal land policies. However, the remote locations and technical precision of the stake repositioning made such explanations increasingly unlikely. The areas where incidents occurred were accessible only by all-terrain vehicles or horseback, located dozens of miles from the nearest public roads, and showing no evidence of unauthorized vehicle access. The phenomenon continued throughout 1992 and 1993, with survey stakes repositioned into increasingly complex geometric patterns that defied easy categorization. Brennan documented 17 separate incidents during this period, each involving multiple stakes moved during overnight hours into formations that demonstrated advanced understanding of mathematical principles. The patterns included perfect pentagons, logarithmic spirals, and arrangements that corresponded to prime number sequences when translated into coordinate systems. Dr. Chen's analysis of the accumulated data revealed patterns that troubled him professionally. These configurations represent solutions to advanced surveying problems that most practicing engineers would need computer assistance to calculate, Chen noted in his 1993 report to the BLM. The precision achieved in field conditions using heavy equipment without leaving evidence of the work process suggests capabilities that exceed normal human limitations. More disturbing was Chen's discovery that several of the geometric patterns corresponded to land survey systems used by 19th century railroad companies and mining operations. Historical research revealed that some configurations matched boundary markers used by the Great Northern Railway during its expansion through Montana in the 1880s and 1890s. Other patterns resembled survey grids employed by copper mining companies that had operated in the region before the wildlife refuge was established. The Bureau of Land Management commissioned a security investigation in 1994, installing motion-activated cameras and seismic sensors at locations where Brennan planned to place survey stakes. The surveillance equipment operated for 6 months without recording any unusual activity, though stakes continued to be repositioned during the monitoring period. On 3 occasions, cameras that should have captured any movement in the survey areas showed only empty prairie, despite clear evidence that stakes had been moved sometime between sunset and sunrise. Brennan's final incident report, dated March 15, 1994, described finding survey stakes arranged in a pattern that perfectly matched the original 1864 territorial survey grid for the area, complete with section corners and mile markers that had been officially abandoned when the wildlife refuge was established. The repositioned stakes occupied coordinates that corresponded to property boundaries that had not existed for over 60 years, as if someone was attempting to restore a survey system that predated current federal ownership. The investigation was quietly terminated in June 1994, with BLM administrators citing resource constraints and conflicting priorities for discontinuing surveillance activities. Brennan's request to continue documenting the incidents was denied, and he was transferred to the BLM office in Anchorage, Alaska in September 1994. His replacement was instructed to use permanent survey markers that could not be easily relocated, effectively ending the placement of temporary stakes that had allowed the phenomenon to be documented. All files related to the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge survey incidents were transferred to BLM headquarters in Washington, D.C. in 1995 and classified as administratively sensitive pending review by federal land management agencies. Freedom of Information Act requests for documentation related to the incidents have been denied on grounds that release of the information could compromise ongoing operational security measures. Modern GPS technology and satellite mapping have largely eliminated the need for temporary survey stakes in most federal land management activities. The Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge continues to operate as intended, providing habitat for wildlife and carefully managed grazing opportunities for local ranchers. Boundary disputes are now resolved using digital mapping systems that require no physical markers placed in remote locations. Yet somewhere in federal archives, 17 incident reports document 3 years of impossible precision. Survey stakes moved by unknown hands into geometric patterns that demonstrate mathematical knowledge, surveying expertise, and access to historical land records that no unauthorized individual should possess. The stakes themselves have long since been collected or abandoned, but the questions they raised about who was working in the remote sections of Montana's largest wildlife refuge and why they were so determined to correct boundary lines that had been officially forgotten remain as precisely unanswered as the geometric puzzles they left behind. Some images capture more than the eye remembers seeing. The Absaroka Mountains stretch along the border between Montana and Wyoming, forming a rugged wilderness barrier, punctuated by glacial valleys, alpine lakes, and peaks that exceed 12,000 feet elevation. East Rosebud Creek flows through one of these valleys, carving a path between granite walls toward its eventual confluence with the Yellowstone River 30 miles downstream. The Creek Valley sits entirely within the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness Area, designated in 1978 to preserve over 900,000 acres of pristine mountain terrain from development or motorized access. The East Rosebud drainage has attracted hikers and backpackers for decades due to its spectacular alpine scenery and relatively accessible trailhead located 12 miles southwest of Red Lodge. The main trail follows the creek for approximately 15 miles, gaining 3,000 feet in elevation as it passes several named lakes before terminating at the Continental Divide. Forest Service records indicate that this trail receives moderate use during summer months, with an estimated 800 to 1,000 hikers completing various sections of the route annually. Historical research reveals limited human activity in the East Rosebud Valley prior to its wilderness designation. Mining claims were filed in the area during the 1880s and 1890s, though no significant mineral extraction occurred due to the remote location and challenging access. Forest Service archives contain references to a few prospector cabins built in remote locations during this period, but specific locations and construction details were never systematically documented before the sites were abandoned in the early 1900s. The first documented incident occurred on August 14, 1989, when Denver photographer Janet Morrison was conducting a multi-day backpacking trip through the East Rosebud Valley. Morrison, who specialized in wilderness landscape photography, was documenting various sections of the trail for a planned guidebook about Montana hiking destinations. On her second day, approximately 8 miles from the trailhead, Morrison stopped to photograph a particularly scenic section where the creek formed a series of small cascades between moss-covered boulders. Morrison took 12 photographs of the area using a 35mm camera loaded with color slide film. When the film was developed 3 weeks later, 11 of the images showed the expected mountain scenery. The 12th photograph, taken from the same position as the others, contained an additional element that Morrison could not recall seeing: a weathered log cabin situated approximately 50 yards from the creek, partially hidden among ponderosa pines on the valley's northern slope. The cabin appeared to be a substantial structure, built from chinked logs with a stone chimney from which thin smoke was visibly rising. The photograph showed the building in sharp focus, suggesting it was a prominent feature of the landscape rather than a barely visible detail. Morrison's field notes from the trip, which she had maintained meticulously throughout her career, contained no mention of seeing any structures during her hike. She specifically remembered the Cascade area because of its photographic potential, yet had no conscious memory of the cabin that appeared so clearly in her developed film. Morrison contacted the Custer National Forest office in Red Lodge to inquire about historical structures in the East Rosebud Valley. Forest Service historian David Chen informed her that no permanent structures were known to exist in the wilderness area, and that any buildings predating the 1978 designation would have been removed or would have deteriorated beyond recognition. Chen's research of historical records found no documentation of cabin construction at the location Morrison had photographed. Troubled by the discrepancy between her memory and the photographic evidence, Morrison returned to the East Rosebud Valley in September 1989, hiking to the exact coordinates where her photograph had been taken. She found the moss-covered cascades exactly as she remembered them, but saw no evidence of any cabin or cleared area where a structure might have stood. The forest showed no signs of human activity, with undisturbed undergrowth and mature trees growing in the location where her photograph clearly showed a substantial building. Morrison's experience gained attention in outdoor photography circles after she shared her story in a 1990 article published in Backpacker magazine. The article prompted several readers to examine their own photographs from the East Rosebud area, leading to additional reports of similar anomalies. Chicago photographer Robert Martinez contacted Morrison after discovering a cabin in one of his 1987 photographs from the same general area, despite having no memory of seeing any structures during his trip. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychology professor at the University of Montana, who specialized in memory and perception research, became interested in the East Rosebud incidents after reading Morrison's article. Chen theorized that the photographers might be experiencing a form of selective attention, unconsciously filtering out unexpected elements in familiar environments. However, her attempts to explain the phenomenon faced a significant obstacle. The photographs showed structures that would be impossible to overlook, particularly the smoke rising from chimneys that indicated active habitation. Between 1990 and 1995, Chen documented 14 separate incidents involving photographers who discovered unexpected buildings in their images from the East Rosebud Valley. The reports showed remarkable consistency. Hikers would photograph scenic areas along the creek, develop their film, and discover clear images of what appeared to be the same log cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. In every case, the photographers insisted they had seen only undisturbed forest at the time the photographs were taken. The cabin's appearance in photographs remained consistent across different cameras, film types, and lighting conditions. Digital photography, which became more common in the mid-1990s, produced the same results as traditional film. The structure always appeared in the same location relative to the creek and surrounding terrain, suggesting that whatever was being photographed occupied a fixed position in the landscape. Forest Service officials conducted a comprehensive survey of the East Rosebud Valley in 1996, using both ground crews and aerial reconnaissance to document any structures or evidence of historical building activity. The survey found no cabins, no foundation remains, and no cleared areas that would indicate past construction. Soil samples from the location where photographers consistently captured images of the cabin showed no evidence of human activity or structural modifications. Dr. Chen's research took an unexpected direction when she obtained copies of historical photographs from local archives and discovered images of the East Rosebud Valley taken during the early 1900s. Several of these historical photographs, taken by Forest Service personnel and mining surveyors, showed what appeared to be the same cabin in the same location where modern photographers were capturing its image. The historical documentation suggested that a structure had indeed existed in the area, though official records contained no mention of its construction or removal. The Forest Service response to Chen's findings was notably reserved. District Ranger Patricia Rodriguez stated in a 1997 memo that historical photographic evidence does not constitute proof of current structures requiring management attention. The memo noted that wilderness regulations prohibited the maintenance or reconstruction of pre-designation buildings and that any structures visible in contemporary photographs must be considered photographic anomalies, requiring no administrative action. Chen's research funding was discontinued in 1998 when the university declined to renew her project grant, citing insufficient academic merit for continued investigation. Her attempts to publish her findings in peer-reviewed journals were unsuccessful, with reviewers consistently noting that the phenomenon fell outside established academic disciplines and lacked sufficient experimental controls for scientific validation. Modern digital photography has not eliminated the East Rosebud cabin sightings. Hikers continue to discover the structure in their photographs, though reports have become less frequent as word of the phenomenon has spread, and many photographers now avoid the area entirely. Online hiking forums contain occasional discussions of the incidents, typically dismissed as hoaxes or equipment malfunctions by users who have not personally experienced the anomaly. The Forest Service maintains that no structures exist in the East Rosebud Wilderness area, and that reported sightings represent misidentification of natural features or photographic artifacts. Official trail maps show no buildings along the creek, and wilderness rangers receive no training regarding historical cabin sites or unusual photography reports from hikers. Yet in photo albums and digital files across the country, the same weathered cabin continues to appear in images taken by people who insist they never saw it. The structure sits among the pines, with smoke rising from its chimney, as permanent in photographs as it is absent from memory, documenting a presence that exists only in the space between what cameras record and what minds remember seeing. Some places refuse to acknowledge the seasons. The Little Belt Mountains rise from the central Montana plains as a modest range of peaks and ridges that rarely exceed 8,000 feet in elevation, yet their position creates a significant barrier to weather patterns moving across the northern Great Plains. Kings Hill Pass cuts through these mountains at 6,700 feet, carrying U.S. Highway 89 between Great Falls and Lewistown, along a route that experiences some of Montana's most severe winter weather conditions. The pass frequently closes during blizzards, with sustained winds exceeding 70 miles per hour and temperatures that can drop below negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time. The highway itself follows a path established by 19th century mining roads that connected gold camps in the Belt Creek drainage to supply routes from Fort Benton. Historical records indicate that winter travel through Kings Hill Pass was considered impossible from November through April during the territorial period, with several documented cases of entire pack trains becoming lost in blizzards and not being found until spring snowmelt revealed their remains. Modern snow removal equipment and weather monitoring have made year-round travel possible, though the Montana Department of Transportation still closes the pass during the most severe storm conditions. The terrain around Kings Hill Pass consists primarily of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir forests, interspersed with alpine meadows that bloom briefly during the short mountain summer. Geological surveys indicate that the area sits atop limestone and sandstone formations deposited during ancient sea periods, with no unusual mineral compositions or geothermal features that would explain localized temperature variations. The Little Belt Mountains lack the volcanic activity that creates hot springs in other parts of Montana, and no thermal features have ever been documented in the Kings Hill Pass area. The temperature anomaly was first measured on December 15, 1985, by Montana State University graduate student Lisa Martinez, who was conducting research on microclimate variations in high-elevation ecosystems for her master's thesis in environmental science. Martinez had placed digital temperature sensors at various locations around Kings Hill Pass to monitor how topographic features influenced local weather patterns during winter months. The sensors were designed to record temperature and humidity data every 15 minutes, providing detailed information about how mountain terrain modified regional climate conditions. One sensor, positioned in a small clearing approximately 300 yards from the highway, began recording data that Martinez initially assumed represented equipment malfunction, while other sensors in the area registered temperatures ranging from 10 to 20 degrees below zero during a severe cold snap in mid-December. The clearing sensor consistently showed readings of exactly 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Martinez hiked to the location on December 18th to retrieve what she believed was defective equipment, expecting to find a damaged instrument that would need replacement. Instead, Martinez discovered that the temperature readings were accurate. Standing in the center of a precisely circular area roughly 12 feet in diameter, she could remove her winter jacket and remain comfortable, despite ambient air temperatures of negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, just outside the circle's boundary. The temperature transition was so abrupt that Martinez could hold one hand in the warm zone, while the other experienced the bitter cold of the surrounding environment. Martinez documented her discovery with multiple thermometers, confirming that the circular area maintained a steady temperature of 74 degrees, regardless of weather conditions in the surrounding forest. Snow fell normally throughout the region, but melted immediately upon entering the warm zone, creating a perfect circle of bare ground surrounded by accumulating snowpack. Wind patterns seemed unaffected by the temperature anomaly, with bitter air moving through the warm zone without apparent heat exchange or atmospheric disturbance. The phenomenon defied basic principles of thermodynamics that Martinez had studied throughout her academic career. Heat sources require energy inputs, and the warm zone showed no evidence of geothermal activity, electrical systems, or combustion that could explain the sustained temperature differential. More puzzling was the precise boundary of the effect. Temperature readings dropped from 74 degrees to ambient conditions within a distance of less than 6 inches, suggesting an energy source that operated according to unknown physical principles. Martinez reported her findings to her thesis advisor, Dr. Robert Chen, who accompanied her to the site on January 8, 1986. Chen brought calibrated instruments from the university's physics department, including infrared thermometers and atmospheric monitoring equipment designed to detect gas emissions or electromagnetic fields that might explain the temperature anomaly. His measurements confirmed Martinez's observations and ruled out conventional explanations for the phenomenon. The thermodynamic properties we documented at Kings Hill Pass violate several fundamental laws of physics, Chen noted in his preliminary report to the university. The sustained temperature differential requires an energy source that we cannot identify, operating through mechanisms that we cannot explain using current scientific understanding. Chen's report recommended expanded research involving multiple academic departments and possibly federal scientific agencies with access to more sophisticated monitoring equipment. The Montana State University Administration approved funding for a comprehensive study of the Kings Hill Pass anomaly in February 1986. Chen assembled a research team that included physicists, geologists, and atmospheric scientists, along with sophisticated equipment borrowed from national laboratories. The team established a permanent monitoring station near the warm zone and began collecting data on electromagnetic fields, soil composition, groundwater characteristics, and atmospheric chemistry that might explain the temperature phenomenon. Over 18 months of research, the team documented the anomaly's consistent behavior across all seasonal conditions. The 12-foot circle maintained 74 degrees during spring blizzards, summer thunderstorms, and autumn freeze cycles that brought ambient temperatures below zero. Soil temperatures within the circle remained constant, at depths up to 6 feet, while temperatures outside the boundary followed normal seasonal patterns. No energy source could be identified, and no physical mechanism could explain the precise temperature control. Dr. Chen's team made one additional discovery that troubled the researchers more than the temperature anomaly itself. Historical research revealed that the exact coordinates of the warm zone had been the site of a weather monitoring station operated by the Army Signal Corps during the 1880s and 1890s. The station had been established to provide weather information for military operations in the region, but official records contain no details about its equipment or operational procedures. The station was reportedly abandoned in 1896 for reasons not specified in available documentation. Local tribal histories, gathered through interviews with Blackfeet and Little Shell tribal members, contained references to a warm place in the Little Belt Mountains that had been known to indigenous peoples for generations before European settlement. Several elders described the location as a place where travelers could find shelter during severe winter storms, though they also noted cultural prohibitions against camping or sleeping within the warm area. The reasons for these prohibitions were not clearly preserved in oral traditions. The research project was abruptly terminated in August 1987, when the Department of Energy informed Montana State University that the Kings Hill Pass site had been classified as relevant to national security interests. All research materials, including 18 months of data and Dr. Chen's preliminary findings, were transferred to federal custody. Team members were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and the university was prohibited from conducting further research at the location. Dr. Chen was offered a position with the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, which he accepted in September 1987. Lisa Martinez completed her master's degree using alternative research data from a different location, with no mention of the Kings Hill Pass work in her thesis. Other team members were reassigned to unrelated projects, and the research group was dissolved. No peer-reviewed publications resulted from the 18-month investigation. The warm zone continues to operate exactly as Martinez first documented it in 1985. Highway maintenance crews working near Kings Hill Pass occasionally report the phenomenon, though the Montana Department of Transportation has issued no official statements regarding temperature anomalies in the area. The site remains accessible to hikers and cross-country skiers, though no warning signs or explanatory materials have been posted. Winter travelers occasionally discover the warm zone by accident, finding temporary relief from severe weather conditions before continuing their journeys. Most assume they have encountered a small geothermal feature and do not report their experience to authorities. The circle of bare ground remains visible throughout winter months. A 12-foot island of impossible warmth surrounded by snow that acknowledges no scientific explanation for its existence. In federal files that will never be declassified, 18 months of measurements document a place where the fundamental laws of physics quietly refuse to apply, where energy appears from nowhere to maintain a perfect temperature that serves no apparent purpose, except to demonstrate that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve. Some distances refuse to be measured correctly. U.S. Highway 2 stretches across northern Montana as part of the longest east-west highway in the United States, connecting the Pacific Northwest to the Great Lakes region through over 1,600 miles of varied terrain. The Montana section runs parallel to the Canadian border, crossing the Blackfeet Indian Reservation and serving as the primary transportation corridor for communities scattered across the state's remote northern tier. Between the towns of Browning and Cutbank, the highway traverses 53 miles of rolling prairie, punctuated by occasional coulees and creek bottoms, representing one of the most geographically uniform sections of the entire transcontinental route. This stretch of Highway 2 was completed in 1932 as part of the Federal Highway System expansion, following survey routes originally established by the Great Northern Railway in the 1880s. The roadway runs almost perfectly straight across the Blackfeet Reservation, deviating only slightly to accommodate natural drainage patterns and property boundaries established during the reservation's creation in 1888. Historical records indicate that the route was chosen specifically for its directness and engineering simplicity, avoiding the complex grading and bridge construction required in more mountainous areas of the state. The Montana Department of Transportation maintains detailed documentation of highway distances for maintenance scheduling, fuel tax calculations, and emergency response coordination. Official surveys conducted using satellite GPS technology and verified through multiple independent measurements consistently show the distance between Browning and Cutbank as exactly 127.4 miles. These measurements have been confirmed by Federal Highway Administration surveys, commercial mapping companies, and university research projects that use the route as a baseline for testing surveying equipment. The discrepancy was first systematically documented in 1993 by Montana State Highway Patrol Trooper Dennis Morrison who noticed that his patrol car's odometer consistently registered higher mileage than expected when traveling between Browning and Cutbank. Morrison initially attributed the difference to odometer calibration errors, but testing with multiple vehicles and different odometer systems produced identical results. Every vehicle driven between the two towns registered 128 miles of travel, exactly 0.6 of a mile more than official measurements indicated the distance should be. Morrison began documenting the anomaly during routine patrols, recording odometer readings, travel times, and fuel consumption data for trips between Browning and Cutbank. Over 6 months of measurements, he found that the extra distance appeared consistently, regardless of weather conditions, traffic patterns, or driving speeds. The additional mileage could not be explained by detours, construction zones, or measurement errors, as Morrison followed the same route marked on official highway maps and verified his path using landmarks and mile markers. More puzzling was Morrison's discovery that the extra distance seemed to accumulate gradually throughout the journey, rather than appearing at a specific location. Odometer readings, taken at regular intervals, showed a steady divergence from expected mileage that increased proportionally along the route. By the time drivers reached Cutbank, their odometers had registered 0.6 of a mile more travel than GPS measurements indicated they should have covered. Morrison's supervisor, Captain Robert Chen of the Montana Highway Patrol, initially dismissed the reports as equipment malfunction or calculation errors. However, Chen's own test drive between Browning and Cutbank in October 1993 confirmed Morrison's observations. Chen's patrol car, equipped with recently calibrated odometer and GPS systems, registered the same discrepancy: 128 miles of travel, along a route that satellite measurements showed as 127.4 miles. The phenomenon gained wider attention when Great Falls Tribune transportation reporter Lisa Martinez began investigating unusual highway conditions for a series on rural Montana infrastructure. Martinez's article, published in December 1993, included interviews with commercial truck drivers who regularly traveled Highway 2 between Browning and Cutbank. Several drivers confirmed experiencing the same odometer discrepancy, though most had attributed it to individual vehicle problems rather than a systematic anomaly. Martinez documented her own experience driving the route in a rental car with a freshly calibrated odometer, accompanied by a GPS unit and detailed highway maps. Her measurements matched those reported by Morrison and other drivers. Satellite navigation showed a distance of 127.4 miles, while her odometer registered exactly 128 miles. The additional distance accumulated gradually throughout the journey, with no specific segment showing greater discrepancy than others. Dr. Sarah Chen, a physics professor at the University of Montana, became interested in the Highway 2 anomaly after reading Martinez's article. Chen theorized that the discrepancy might result from subtle variations in road surface elevation or curvature that were not accounted for in satellite measurements, which calculate straight-line distances rather than actual travel paths. However, her analysis of highway engineering records showed that the Browning to Cutbank section was built with minimal elevation changes and curves so gradual that they should not significantly affect distance measurements. Chen organized a comprehensive measurement project in spring 1994, using professional surveying equipment and multiple vehicles to document the Highway 2 discrepancy. Her team included graduate students in physics and engineering, along with surveying specialists from the Montana Department of Transportation. The project confirmed that official distance measurements were accurate according to standard surveying principles, yet every vehicle driven along the route registered additional mileage that could not be explained through conventional means. The most troubling aspect of Chen's research was her discovery that the extra distance varied slightly but consistently among different drivers. While most vehicles registered approximately 0.6 of a mile additional travel, Some drivers experienced variations ranging from 0.4 to 0.8 of a mile. The variations did not correlate with vehicle type, driving speed, or weather conditions, suggesting that individual drivers somehow influenced the amount of extra distance they experienced. Chen's team also documented temporal anomalies during their measurements. Travel times between Browning and Cut Bank consistently exceeded calculations based on distance and speed, with drivers losing between 3 and 7 minutes compared to expected journey duration. GPS tracking showed vehicles maintaining steady speeds throughout the trip. Yet chronometer measurements indicated that more time had elapsed than physics would predict for the recorded distance and velocity. The Montana Department of Transportation responded to Chen's findings with a comprehensive review of Highway 2 surveying data, conducted in partnership with the Federal Highway Administration in 1995. The review confirmed that all official measurements were accurate and that no surveying errors existed in the documentation of the Browning to Cut Bank section. However, the review also acknowledged that unexplained variations in travel distance measurements had been consistently reported by multiple independent sources. Rather than investigating further, the Montana DOT issued a technical bulletin in 1996, stating that minor discrepancies between official highway distances and individual odometer readings should be considered normal variations related to vehicle calibration factors and measurement methodology differences. The bulletin recommended that law enforcement agencies adjust their mileage calculations accordingly, effectively acknowledging the problem while declining to explain it. Dr. Chen's research funding was not renewed for 1997, with the university citing budget constraints and competing research priorities. Her attempts to publish findings about the Highway 2 anomaly were unsuccessful, with academic journals noting that the phenomenon fell outside established physics disciplines and lacked sufficient theoretical framework for peer review. Chen's data and equipment were transferred to university archives, where they remain classified as ongoing research materials despite no current research activity. Modern GPS navigation systems continue to show the Browning to Cut Bank distance as 127.4 miles, while drivers consistently experience 128 miles of travel. The discrepancy has become an accepted part of local knowledge among people who regularly use the route, though most decline to discuss it with outsiders. Truck drivers and traveling salespeople simply adjust their mileage calculations to account for the extra distance, treating it as an unexplained but predictable feature of Highway 2. The phenomenon persists regardless of technological advances in GPS accuracy or vehicle odometer calibration. Satellite imagery clearly shows a straight highway running across level prairie for exactly the distance that surveying mathematics indicates. Yet somewhere along that perfectly mapped route, every driver travels through an additional 0.6 of a mile that exists in their experience, but not in any measurement system designed to quantify distance. In the space between what maps show and what odometers record, between satellite precision and human experience, Highway 2 contains a mile that belongs to no surveying system and follows no law of physics, measuring the distance between 2 points with mathematics that refuses to add up correctly. Some archives refuse to stay buried. Garnet Ghost Town sits in the remote foothills of the Garnet Range, 35 miles northeast of Missoula, Montana, accessible only by 11 miles of gravel road that becomes impassable during winter months. The town represents one of Montana's best preserved mining settlements, abandoned when the last profitable gold claims played out in the 1940s, but maintained as a historical site by the Bureau of Land Management since 1970. At its peak in the 1890s, Garnet housed over 1,000 residents, supported by 13 saloons, 4 stores, a hotel, and a school serving the children of miners who worked the placer deposits and hard rock claims scattered throughout the surrounding hills. The mining operations that built Garnet left behind an extensive network of tunnels, shafts, and underground workings that honeycomb the mountainsides for miles in every direction. Historical surveys conducted during the town's active period documented over 200 separate mining claims, connected by transport tunnels that allowed ore carts to move between different workings and processing facilities. Most of these underground passages were sealed or collapsed naturally after the mines closed, but geological surveys suggest that substantial sections of the tunnel network remain intact beneath the abandoned town and surrounding forest. The Montana Historical Society maintains comprehensive records of Garnet's mining operations in their Helena archives, including claim maps, tunnel surveys, ore production reports, and correspondence between mine operators and territorial government officials. These documents represent one of the most complete collections of 19th-century mining records in the state, providing detailed information about extraction techniques, labor conditions, and the economic factors that ultimately led to the town's abandonment. Researchers studying Montana's mining history consider the Garnet collection an invaluable resource for understanding the social and economic dynamics of territorial-era gold camps. The light phenomenon was first documented on October 12, 1979, by University of Montana graduate student Robert Martinez, who had spent the previous day researching garnet mining records at the Montana Historical Society for his master's thesis on labor conditions in 19th-century mining camps. Martinez was conducting follow-up field research at the ghost town when he observed unusual lights appearing above the abandoned buildings at approximately 9:30 p.m. The lights consisted of multiple points of blue-white illumination that moved in slow, deliberate patterns across the town site and surrounding hillsides. Martinez initially assumed the lights represented aircraft or vehicles, but their movement patterns and duration ruled out conventional explanations. The lights appeared to follow specific paths that corresponded to no existing roads or trails, often passing through areas of dense forest where vehicle travel would be impossible. More puzzling was their apparent relationship to underground features. The lights moved in straight lines and geometric patterns that seemed to trace the locations of mining tunnels documented in historical surveys, as if someone was illuminating the buried infrastructure from above. The lights continued for approximately 45 minutes before disappearing simultaneously, leaving Martinez to wonder if he had witnessed some form of military exercise or scientific research activity. However, inquiries to the Federal Aviation Administration and local military installations revealed no authorized aircraft operations in the Garnet area on the night in question. Martinez documented his observations in his field notes, but initially considered the incident too unusual to include in his academic research. 2 months later, Martinez returned to the Montana Historical Society to review additional mining records for his thesis research. Exactly 48 hours after his December 14th archive visit, the lights reappeared above Garnet Ghost Town, following nearly identical patterns to those he had observed in October. This time, Martinez was accompanied by fellow graduate student Lisa Chen, who confirmed his observations and helped document the phenomenon with photographs that showed distinct points of light moving in organized formations above the abandoned town. The timing correlation troubled Martinez more than the lights themselves. The 48-hour delay between accessing the mining records and the appearance of the lights suggested a connection that defied logical explanation. Martinez began maintaining detailed logs of his archive visits and corresponding observations at Garnet, discovering that the lights appeared consistently after every research session involving the ghost town's mining documentation. The phenomenon occurred regardless of weather conditions, moon phase, or seasonal factors. Dr. Sarah Chen, Martinez's thesis advisor, initially attributed the correlation to coincidence or confirmation bias, but became interested when other researchers reported similar experiences. Between 1980 and 1985, 7 different students and faculty members documented lights above Garnet Ghost Town occurring exactly 48 hours after they had accessed the town's mining records at the Montana Historical Society. The observations showed remarkable consistency in timing, location, and the apparent relationship between light patterns and underground tunnel systems. The Montana Historical Society's response to inquiries about the garnet phenomenon was notably evasive. Archival staff claimed no knowledge of any connection between research visits and reported light sightings, despite multiple documented cases involving their patrons. When researchers requested information about other visitors who had accessed the garnet mining collection, they were told that patron records were confidential and could not be shared for research purposes. Dr. James Morrison, a physics professor at Montana Tech, who became interested in the lights through academic networking, attempted to study the phenomenon systematically in 1986. Morrison's research design involved coordinated observations at Garnet Ghost Town following scheduled visits to the Montana Historical Society archives. His team used professional photography equipment and electromagnetic field detectors to document any unusual activity in the area. Morrison's research confirmed the 48-hour timing pattern and documented lights that appeared to move in formations corresponding to historical tunnel maps. More disturbing was his discovery that the lights seemed responsive to the specific mining records that had been accessed. When researchers focused on documents related to particular claims or tunnel systems, the subsequent light displays concentrated on those same geographic areas, as if illuminating the exact underground features that had been studied in the archives. The electromagnetic readings during light events showed anomalous spikes that Morrison's equipment could not fully characterize. The readings suggested organized electromagnetic activity rather than random atmospheric phenomena, but the patterns did not correspond to any known natural or artificial sources. Morrison's attempts to track the lights with radar equipment were unsuccessful, as the objects did not appear on electronic detection systems, despite being clearly visible to observers. Morrison's research was interrupted in 1987 when the Montana Historical Society announced that access to the garnet mining collection would be restricted pending conservation assessment and archival reorganization. The collection was temporarily removed from public access, effectively ending the research project that had been documenting the correlation between archive visits and light phenomena. Morrison's grant funding was not renewed, and his research data was archived without publication. The mining records were quietly digitized and returned to limited access in 1998, though researchers were now required to view documents electronically rather than handling original materials. Historical Society staff provided no explanation for the 11-year restriction period or the decision to digitize the collection ahead of other archival priorities. When asked about research activities involving the garnet materials during the restricted period, administrators claimed that no systematic studies had been conducted. The digitization process seems to have altered the phenomenon's characteristics. Researchers who access the electronic versions of garnet mining records report reduced frequency and intensity of light events, though the 48-hour timing pattern persists. Some observers suggest that the lights now appear fainter and less organized than during the period when original documents were being consulted, as if the physical connection between paper records and underground locations had been somehow weakened. Modern researchers studying Montana mining history are generally unaware of the light phenomenon, as information about the correlation has never been published in academic literature. The Montana Historical Society's staff training materials contain no references to unusual events related to the garnet collection, and new employees are not briefed on the documented pattern of archive access and subsequent light sightings. Yet the underground infrastructure remains, mapped in documents that exist now only as digital images, while the tunnels themselves continue to trace their paths beneath the abandoned town. The lights still appear above Garnet Ghost Town, dimmer now but following the same patterns, as if something buried in those hills continues to respond when its secrets are disturbed, illuminating pathways that were meant to stay dark and forgotten. Some sounds refuse to follow the laws of time. McDonald Lake stretches 10 miles through the heart of Glacier National Park, its pristine waters reflecting the towering peaks of the Continental Divide in northwestern Montana. The lake sits at 3,200 feet elevation, formed by glacial action during the last ice age, and fed by snowmelt from surrounding peaks that exceed 8,000 feet. The Going to the Sun Road follows the lake's southern shore for much of its length, providing access to one of the park's most photographed landscapes. The North Shore remains largely undeveloped, accessible only by foot trails that wind through old-growth cedar and hemlock forests toward remote camping areas used by backcountry hikers. The lake's unique geography creates natural acoustic properties that have been noted since the area's designation as a national park in 1910. Early park rangers documented how sounds carry unusually well across the water, with conversations from the opposite shore clearly audible on calm days, despite the lake's considerable width. The surrounding mountain walls amplify and redirect sound waves in patterns that create distinct echoes, particularly along the steeper sections of the North Shore, where granite cliffs rise directly from the water's edge. Indigenous peoples, primarily the Blackfeet and Salish tribes, traveled through the McDonald Lake area for thousands of years before European exploration, using established routes that connected hunting grounds on either side of the Continental Divide. Tribal oral histories contain references to the lake as a place where voices could be heard across great distances, though specific details about acoustic anomalies were not systematically recorded by early ethnographers. Some tribal accounts describe the North Shore as a location where words travel in circles, though the meaning of this phrase remains unclear in translated versions. The acoustic anomaly was first officially documented on July 23, 1968, when Glacier National Park Ranger Michael Morrison was conducting a routine patrol along the North Shore Trail system. Morrison was testing his radio equipment at a location approximately 3 miles from the lake's western end when he experienced what he initially assumed was radio malfunction. While speaking into his radio microphone, Morrison heard his own words being repeated back to him before he had finished saying them, as if someone was anticipating his speech and broadcasting it simultaneously. Morrison stopped speaking and listened carefully, determining that the repeated words were not coming through his radio, but rather echoing naturally from across the lake. When he resumed his radio transmission, the phenomenon repeated. His words seemed to echo back from the opposite shore before the sound of his voice had time to travel across the water and return. Morrison tested the effect by shouting simple phrases toward the lake, consistently hearing echoes that arrived before he had completed speaking. The timing of the echoes troubled Morrison more than their occurrence. Sound traveling across McDonald Lake should require several seconds to reach the opposite shore and return. Yet the echoes he was hearing arrived while he was still speaking, sometimes anticipating words he had not yet said. Morrison documented the incident in his patrol log, noting the specific location and time of the acoustic anomaly, though he initially chose not to report it through official channels due to concerns about the credibility of his account. 3 months later, Morrison brought Ranger Robert Chen to the same location to verify his observations. Chen confirmed that echoes were arriving before sounds had time to complete their normal propagation across the lake. The two rangers conducted systematic tests using stopwatches and predetermined phrases, documenting that echo delays were consistently shorter than physics would predict, based on the distance sound needed to travel. More disturbing was their discovery that the echoes sometimes contained words they had not yet spoken, as if the acoustic reflection was anticipating their intended speech. Chen's documentation of the phenomenon prompted a visit from Glacier National Park's chief naturalist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had advanced training in geology and natural history interpretation. Martinez spent 2 days at the North Shore location in October 1968, confirming the acoustic anomaly and attempting to develop scientific explanations for the unusual echo patterns. Her preliminary report noted that the phenomenon violated basic principles of sound propagation and suggested that atmospheric conditions or unknown geological features might be creating unusual acoustic effects. Word of the McDonald Lake echoes spread informally among park staff and visiting researchers throughout the early 1970s. Dr. James Chen, a physics professor from Montana State University, visited the location in 1973 and documented what he described as temporally displaced acoustic reflections that arrived before normal echo timing would predict. Chen's informal observations suggested that sound waves were somehow taking shorter paths across the lake than straight-line distance measurements indicated possible. The phenomenon gained wider attention when National Geographic photographer Lisa Rodriguez mentioned the unusual echoes in a 1975 article about Glacier National Park's acoustic landscapes. Rodriguez's brief description of voices that echo before they finish speaking prompted inquiries from acoustic researchers and sound engineers who were interested in studying the phenomenon under controlled conditions. However, Rodriguez declined to provide specific location information, noting that park officials had requested discretion regarding unusual natural phenomena that might attract unwanted visitor attention. Dr. Robert Morrison, a sound engineering specialist from the University of Montana, obtained permission from the National Park Service to conduct comprehensive acoustic studies at McDonald Lake during summer 1985. Morrison's research team brought professional recording equipment, spectrum analyzers, and synchronized timing devices designed to measure sound propagation with millisecond precision. The study was intended to document the anomalous echo patterns and identify their underlying physical causes. The research project encountered immediate technical difficulties when Morrison's team arrived at the North Shore location in June 1985. Digital recording equipment that had functioned normally during preliminary tests began producing corrupted data files when used near the lake. Spectrum analyzers showed anomalous readings that suggested sound frequencies outside normal human hearing ranges, though no acoustic source for these readings could be identified. Most troubling, synchronized timing devices consistently disagreed about elapsed time measurements, making precise documentation of echo delays impossible. Morrison's team spent 6 weeks attempting to overcome their technical problems, replacing equipment and adjusting experimental procedures to account for the inexplicable instrument malfunctions. Their preliminary data showed echo patterns that defied conventional acoustic principles, with sound reflections arriving at the recording location before their sources had completed transmission. However, the equipment failures prevented the team from gathering sufficient data to support publishable scientific conclusions. The research project was abruptly terminated in August 1985 when Morrison received notification from the University of Montana that his field research authorization had been revoked due to environmental impact concerns raised by the National Park Service. Morrison's team was required to remove their equipment immediately and cease all acoustic measurements at McDonald Lake. When Morrison requested copies of his preliminary data for analysis, he was informed that the research files had been lost due to a clerical error during routine data backup procedures. Morrison's attempts to republish his research findings were unsuccessful, as academic journals required complete datasets that no longer existed following the clerical error. The University of Montana declined to provide funding for follow-up research, citing budget constraints and questioning the scientific merit of studying acoustic anomalies that could not be reliably reproduced under controlled conditions. Morrison's career focus subsequently shifted to conventional acoustic engineering projects that did not involve field research in national parks. The National Park Service response to inquiries about acoustic research at McDonald Lake has remained consistent since 1985. No unusual sound phenomena have been officially documented, and normal acoustic properties of the lake environment adequately explain any echoes that visitors might experience. Park rangers receive no training regarding acoustic anomalies, and visitor center information makes no mention of unusual sound effects along the North Shore Trail system. Modern visitors to McDonald Lake occasionally report strange echo effects, though these accounts are typically dismissed as misperceptions or normal acoustic phenomena misunderstood by untrained observers. Hiking guides and park literature describe the lake's natural beauty and wildlife viewing opportunities without mentioning acoustic properties that might attract visitors seeking unusual experiences. The North Shore Trail system remains lightly used compared to other park attractions, visited primarily by experienced backpackers seeking solitude rather than tourists interested in natural curiosities. Yet the lake continues to reflect more than just mountain peaks and sky. Somewhere along its north shore, in a place where ancient voices once carried across water, sound waves continue to follow paths that lead backward through time, creating echoes that arrive before their sources finish speaking, as if the very air remembers words that have not yet been fully spoken. Some patterns exist only when no one is looking. Makoshika State Park encompasses 11,531 acres of rugged badlands in southeastern Montana, near the town of Glendive along the Yellowstone River. The park preserves a stark landscape of eroded sandstone formations, fossil-bearing sedimentary layers, and deep coulees, carved by millions of years of wind and water erosion. The name Makoshika derives from a Lakota phrase meaning bad land or bad earth, reflecting the challenging terrain that early travelers found nearly impassable. Established as Montana's largest state park in 1957, the area protects significant paleontological sites where complete dinosaur skeletons have been discovered, including Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus rex specimens now displayed in museums worldwide. The Badlands terrain consists primarily of Hell Creek Formation rocks deposited during the late Cretaceous period, approximately 66 million years ago. These sedimentary layers contain some of the world's most important fossil records from the end of the dinosaur era, making Makoshika a destination for paleontologists and geology students studying mass extinction events. The landscape appears chaotic to casual observers, with randomly eroded pillars, buttes, and drainage patterns that seem to follow no organizing principle beyond the natural forces of erosion and weathering that have shaped the region since the retreat of ancient seas. Geological surveys conducted during the park's establishment documented the area's scientific significance, but noted no unusual surface features beyond the expected Badlands topography. Early aerial reconnaissance flights, conducted by the Montana Fish and Game Department in the 1950s to assess wildlife habitat, showed typical erosional patterns consistent with similar formations throughout the northern Great Plains. The photographs revealed complex drainage systems, exposed rock layers, and vegetation patterns that followed natural topographic gradients without any apparent artificial or geometric organization. The grid anomaly was first detected on September 14, 1976, during a routine aerial survey conducted by the United States Geological Survey as part of a comprehensive mapping project covering eastern Montana's mineral resources. USGS photographer Michael Rodriguez was using high-resolution cameras to document surface geology when his developed film revealed patterns that had not been visible during the actual flight. The photographs showed a vast geometric grid covering nearly the entire park area, with perfectly straight lines forming squares approximately 100 yards on each side. Rodriguez initially assumed the grid patterns represented processing errors or film defects, but examination of the negatives confirmed that the geometric lines were present in the original exposures. The grid appeared as subtle but distinct variations in photographic contrast, visible only when the film was developed and printed under laboratory conditions. More puzzling was the grid's mathematical precision. The lines formed perfect right angles and maintained consistent spacing across the entire 11,000-acre area, suggesting an underlying organization that defied the chaotic nature of Badlands erosion. USGS technicians who processed Rodriguez's film noted that the grid patterns were not visible in photographs taken from ground level or in earlier aerial surveys of the same area. The geometric lines appeared only in high-altitude photographs taken with specific camera equipment and film types, suggesting that the phenomenon required particular viewing conditions or photographic techniques to become apparent. When Rodriguez returned to fly over the area 3 weeks later, using identical equipment and flying at the same altitude, the grid patterns appeared again in his developed photographs with identical precision and spacing. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geologist with the USGS regional office in Billings, was assigned to investigate the photographic anomaly and determine whether the grid patterns represented previously unknown geological features or technical problems with the survey equipment. Chen's preliminary analysis ruled out equipment malfunction, film processing errors, and atmospheric distortions that might create artificial patterns in aerial photographs. The grid lines appeared consistently across multiple film exposures and showed characteristics that suggested they were capturing real surface features rather than photographic artifacts. Chen's field investigation of Makoshika State Park in October 1976 involved ground truthing, the locations where aerial photographs showed grid intersections. Using GPS coordinates derived from the aerial images, Chen's team visited specific sites where the geometric lines appeared to cross, expecting to find surface features that might explain the photographic patterns. Instead, they found ordinary badlands terrain with no evidence of artificial modification, geometric organization, or unusual geological formations that could account for the grid's appearance in photographs. The disconnect between aerial photography and ground observation troubled Chen more than the grid patterns themselves. The photographs clearly showed geometric lines covering thousands of acres with mathematical precision, yet no corresponding features could be detected by direct visual inspection or standard geological survey methods. Chen's team used metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and soil sampling techniques to search for buried structures or mineral deposits that might create the photographic effects, but found no subsurface anomalies at grid intersection points. Chen's investigation expanded to include historical research on previous land use in the Makoshika area. Her review of territorial surveys, homestead records, and early mining claims revealed no evidence of large-scale geometric development that could explain the grid patterns. The area had been used primarily for cattle grazing during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with no documented construction projects or land modification activities that would create the extensive geometric organization visible in aerial photographs. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, which manages Makoshika State Park, was notified of the photographic anomaly in November 1976. Park administrators initially expressed interest in understanding the grid patterns as they might represent previously unknown archaeological features or geological formations that could enhance the park's scientific and educational value. However, their enthusiasm diminished when they learned that the patterns were visible only in specialized aerial photographs and could not be detected by park visitors or staff using normal observation methods. Chen's final report, submitted to USGS headquarters in December 1976, documented the grid patterns as photographic anomalies of unknown origin that appeared consistently in high-altitude aerial surveys, but corresponded to no detectable surface features. The report recommended additional research using different photographic techniques and ground sensing equipment to determine the physical basis for the geometric patterns. Chen noted that the grid's mathematical precision and extensive coverage suggested artificial origin, though no evidence of human construction could be found through conventional investigation methods. The research project was terminated in January 1977, when the National Aeronautics and Space Administration requested copies of all photographs showing the Makoshika grid patterns for comparative analysis with similar geological research projects. NASA's request was accompanied by a directive from the Department of Interior, classifying the aerial survey materials as sensitive geological data, pending further review by IMPLAID, federal research agencies. Chen's research files were transferred to NASA custody, and she was reassigned to conventional mineral mapping projects in western Montana. NASA's involvement in the Makoshika investigation was never publicly announced, and no explanation was provided for the space agency's interest in Badlands photography. When Chen attempted to obtain copies of her research materials for follow-up analysis, she was informed that the photographs had been incorporated into ongoing geological research programs and were not available for academic or commercial use. NASA's Public Affairs Office issued statements indicating that the agency occasionally assisted other federal departments with specialized remote sensing applications, but provided no details about specific projects or research objectives. Subsequent aerial surveys of Makoshika State Park have been conducted using different photographic equipment and techniques that do not reproduce the grid patterns documented in Rodriguez's 1976 photographs. Modern digital aerial imaging and satellite photography show only natural Badlands topography, with no evidence of the geometric organization that appeared so clearly in the original film exposures. Park visitors and researchers who are aware of the photographic anomaly report seeing only typical erosional landscapes when viewing the area from aircraft or elevated viewpoints. The original photographs remain in NASA custody, though Freedom of Information Act requests for their release have been denied, on grounds that the materials are part of ongoing geological research activities that could be compromised by public disclosure. NASA administrators have indicated that the photographs contain sensitive geological information that requires protection, though they have not specified the nature of this sensitivity or the research programs that justify continued classification. Modern visitors to Makoshika State Park explore a landscape that appears entirely natural, with no hint of the vast geometric organization that once revealed itself to high-altitude cameras using 20th century film technology. The Badlands continue to erode according to natural processes, creating new formations while destroying old ones, following patterns that seem random to human observers. Yet somewhere in federal archives, photographs document a different version of the same landscape, one organized according to principles that have never been explained, captured by cameras that somehow saw what human eyes could never detect. Some measurements refuse to acknowledge the passage of time. Glacier Peak rises 8,747 feet above sea level in the heart of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, one of the largest protected wilderness areas in the continental United States. The peak sits within a roadless expanse of over 1 million acres that stretches across 3 separate wilderness designations in northwestern Montana, encompassing pristine alpine terrain that has remained largely unchanged since the retreat of Pleistocene glaciers. The Bob Marshall Wilderness was established in 1964 as part of the original Wilderness Act, preserving an ecosystem where natural processes continue without human intervention across elevation zones, ranging from valley floors at 4,000 feet to alpine summits exceeding 9,000 feet. The region's weather patterns reflect its position along the Continental Divide, where Pacific storm systems collide with continental air masses to create some of Montana's most unpredictable and severe mountain weather. Atmospheric pressure fluctuations in the area are typically dramatic, with barometric readings varying by several inches of mercury as weather fronts move through the high country. The National Weather Service has maintained monitoring stations throughout the Bob Marshall Wilderness since the early 1960s, providing critical data for aviation safety, flood prediction, and backcountry weather forecasting that helps protect wilderness visitors from sudden storms. Glacier Peak's elevation and isolated position make it an ideal location for atmospheric monitoring, as its weather station receives minimal interference from human activity or localized heating effects that can distort meteorological measurements. The peak's barometric pressure readings serve as a key reference point for regional weather models, helping forecasters understand how storm systems behave as they cross the continental divide. Historical weather data from the Glacier Peak Station has contributed to research on climate patterns, seasonal precipitation cycles, and the atmospheric dynamics that drive Montana's complex mountain weather systems. The atmospheric anomaly was first documented on March 15, 1963, when National Weather Service technician Robert Chen was conducting routine calibration checks on newly installed monitoring equipment at the Glacier Peak Weather Station. Chen's maintenance log noted that one barometric pressure sensor, positioned at exactly 7,200 feet elevation on the peak's northeastern slope, was recording a reading of 30.12 inches of mercury, despite a regional low-pressure system that should have produced measurements several tenths of an inch lower. Chen initially assumed the sensor was malfunctioning and scheduled it for replacement during the next maintenance cycle. However, when he returned to the station 6 weeks later, the same sensor continued to read exactly 30.12 inches of mercury, while adjacent sensors at slightly different elevations were recording normal pressure variations corresponding to changing weather conditions. Chen tested the anomalous sensor with portable calibration equipment and found that it appeared to be functioning correctly according to all technical specifications. The sensor's persistent reading troubled Chen because 30.12 inches of mercury represented neither high nor low pressure, but rather a perfectly average measurement that would normally fluctuate constantly in response to atmospheric changes. Mountain weather stations typically experience barometric pressure variations of 1 to 3 inches of mercury as storm systems pass through the region. Yet, the Glacier Peak sensor maintained its unchanging reading through blizzards, high-pressure systems, and severe storms that produced dramatic pressure changes at all surrounding monitoring locations. Chen's supervisor, National Weather Service meteorologist Dr. Sarah Martinez, visited the Glacier Peak Station in May 1963 to investigate the sensor anomaly. Martinez brought additional calibration equipment and replacement sensors, expecting to identify equipment failure or installation problems that could explain the unchanging barometric reading. Instead, she confirmed that the sensor was functioning normally according to all diagnostic tests, yet continued to register exactly 30.12 inches of mercury, regardless of actual atmospheric conditions. Martinez documented the anomaly by installing additional barometric sensors at various elevations around the same location, creating a network of monitoring points that could detect even subtle pressure variations across the mountainside. Her measurements revealed that atmospheric pressure changed normally at all elevations except for the specific 7,200-foot level, where multiple independent sensors consistently recorded 30.12 inches of mercury. The anomaly appeared to affect a localized area approximately 50 feet in diameter, beyond which normal pressure variations resumed. The persistence of the unchanging barometric reading through seasonal weather patterns convinced Martinez that the phenomenon represented more than equipment malfunction. Over 18 months of monitoring, the anomalous sensors recorded 30.12 inches of mercury through winter blizzards that dropped pressure to 28 inches at nearby stations, summer thunderstorms that briefly raised pressure above 31 inches, and the passage of Hurricane Camille's remnants that created the lowest pressure readings ever recorded in northwestern Montana. Dr. James Morrison, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Montana, became interested in the Glacier Peak anomaly after Martinez presented her findings at a 1965 meteorological conference. Morrison's theoretical analysis suggested that the unchanging pressure reading violated basic principles of atmospheric dynamics, as barometric pressure must fluctuate in response to the movement of air masses and the passage of weather systems. A localized area that maintained constant pressure would require an unknown mechanism capable of isolating that specific location from normal atmospheric processes. Morrison's field investigation of the Glacier Peak site in summer 1966 involved deploying sophisticated atmospheric monitoring equipment designed to detect minute pressure variations that might explain the constant barometric reading. His instruments confirmed Martinez's observations and documented additional anomalies that complicated any theoretical explanation for the phenomenon. Temperature and humidity sensors functioned normally at the location, indicating that only atmospheric pressure remained constant, while other meteorological parameters fluctuated according to expected patterns. More puzzling was Morrison's discovery that wind patterns around the anomalous location showed characteristics suggesting the presence of atmospheric disturbances that his pressure sensors could not detect. Smoke tests and particle tracking revealed air movement patterns that indicated pressure gradients were present and changing. Yet barometric instruments continued to record exactly 30.12 inches of mercury. Morrison's data suggested that normal atmospheric processes were occurring at the location, but that pressure measurement devices were somehow unable to register these changes. The National Weather Service response to Morrison's findings reflected institutional reluctance to acknowledge atmospheric phenomena that could not be explained through conventional meteorology. Morrison's requests for additional research funding were denied, with agency administrators noting that the Glacier Peak anomaly did not affect weather forecasting accuracy, and therefore did not justify the expense of comprehensive investigation. The anomalous sensors were reclassified as equipment requiring routine maintenance, though no maintenance was ever scheduled or performed. Morrison's attempts to publish his research findings encountered similar resistance from academic journals, which noted that atmospheric pressure measurements that defied physical laws fell outside the scope of peer-reviewed meteorological research. Morrison's data was archived at the University of Montana without formal publication, though his documentation continued to accumulate for 3 more years until his research funding was redirected to conventional atmospheric studies that posed no theoretical challenges to established meteorological principles. The National Weather Service gradually reduced monitoring activities at the Glacier Peak Station throughout the 1970s, citing budget constraints and the availability of satellite-based atmospheric data that reduced the need for remote weather stations. The anomalous barometric sensors were left in place, but were no longer included in routine maintenance schedules or data collection protocols. Agency records indicate that the sensors continued to register 30.12 inches of mercury when checked during occasional visits, though these measurements were no longer incorporated into official weather databases. Modern atmospheric monitoring relies primarily on satellite technology and automated weather stations that report data through digital communication systems. The Glacier Peak Weather Station was officially decommissioned in 1987, though some of the original equipment remains in place at the site. Hikers and mountaineers who visit the peak occasionally encounter the abandoned monitoring equipment, including barometric sensors that still display 30.12 inches of mercury, despite decades of exposure to severe mountain weather. The National Weather Service maintains that the Glacier Peak barometric anomaly represented localized equipment calibration issues that were resolved through updated monitoring technology and improved sensor design. Agency spokespersons indicate that modern atmospheric measurement techniques have eliminated the technical problems that produced anomalous readings at remote weather stations during the 1960s and 70s. No current research programs focus on atmospheric pressure anomalies, and the agency's historical weather data from Glacier Peak contains no annotations regarding unusual barometric measurements. Yet somewhere on a mountainside in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, abandoned instruments continue to register the same measurement they have recorded for over 60 years, marking a place where atmospheric pressure exists outside the normal flow of weather systems and seasonal change. The reading remains constant, while storms pass overhead and seasons cycle through their ancient patterns, as if that particular cubic volume of mountain air has been isolated from the atmospheric processes that govern the rest of the planet. Some people refuse to be counted when it matters most. Judith Gap sits in the geographical center of Montana, a small agricultural community of approximately 300 residents located along Highway 12 between Harlowton and Stanford in Wheatland County. The town was established in 1883 as a railroad stop along the Montana Central Railway, serving wheat farmers and cattle ranchers who settled the rich prairie land surrounding the Judith River drainage. Named for the natural gap in the Judith Mountains that provided a passage for early travelers, the community has maintained its rural character for over a century, with a main street lined by grain elevators, a post office, and the essential businesses that support agricultural life in central Montana. The town's population has remained relatively stable since the 1920s, fluctuating between 250 and 400 residents, depending on economic conditions affecting regional agriculture. Most families in Judith Gap have lived in the area for multiple generations, connected through farming partnerships, school relationships, and the interdependent social networks that characterize small rural communities. The town maintains detailed records of births, deaths, and resident movements through its post office, school district, and local government offices, creating a paper trail that documents population changes with the precision necessary for federal reporting requirements. Judith Gap's isolation and stable population make it an ideal location for testing census methodology, as the community's small size allows for complete enumeration, while its geographic separation from larger towns minimizes commuting and temporary residence issues that can complicate population counts in more urbanized areas. The U.S. Census Bureau has used Judith Gap as a reference point for refining rural counting procedures since the 1950 census, when improved transportation and communication made systematic verification of remote community populations more feasible. The counting discrepancy was first documented during the 1960 census, when Bureau enumerator Robert Chen arrived in Judith Gap on April 1st to conduct the official population count mandated by federal law. Chen's preliminary survey, conducted 3 weeks before the official census date, had identified 312 residents living in 137 households within the town's corporate boundaries. However, when Chen returned on April 1st to complete the formal enumeration, he could locate only 265 residents, despite finding no evidence of recent departures or deaths that could account for the missing 47 people. Chen initially assumed that residents had temporarily left town for work or family obligations, a common occurrence in agricultural communities during spring planting season. However, his follow-up investigation revealed that the missing residents had not departed Judith Gap, nor could they be located in surrounding communities or cities where temporary relocation might be expected. More puzzling was Chen's discovery that local businesses, schools, and service providers continued to report serving the same number of customers and clients they had documented before the census date. The missing residents represented entire families rather than individual departures, with Chen's records showing that 47 people from 14 different households had become unaccounted for between his preliminary survey and the official count. These families included long-term residents with established community ties, business owners whose enterprises continued operating normally, and children enrolled in local schools who were marked present for classes on census day yet could not be located by Chen's door-to-door enumeration efforts. Chen's supervisor, Census Bureau Regional Coordinator, Dr. Sarah Martinez, traveled to Judith Gap in May 1960 to investigate the enumeration discrepancy. Martinez brought additional staff members and conducted a comprehensive recount that confirmed Chen's findings. The town contained 265 verifiable residents, while local records and community knowledge suggested a population of 312 people. The 47 missing residents were known to community members, maintained active local relationships, and appeared to be present in all social and economic contexts, except the formal census count. Martinez's investigation expanded to include interviews with Judith Gap residents about the missing 47 people. Community members confirmed that the absent individuals were long-term residents who had been present in town during the weeks preceding the census. Local business owners reported serving these customers regularly, including transactions conducted on Census Day itself. The post office confirmed active mail delivery to addresses associated with the missing residents, and the school district reported attendance by children whose families Chen had been unable to locate. The contradiction between community knowledge and census enumeration troubled Martinez more than the simple population discrepancy. Judith Gap residents seemed genuinely confused by questions about the missing 47 people, acknowledging their existence and continued presence, while being unable to provide specific information about their whereabouts during the official count. When asked directly about particular missing individuals, residents would confirm knowing them and seeing them recently, yet could not recall specific interactions or encounters that occurred on April 1st. Dr. James Morrison, a sociologist from Montana State University who specialized in rural population dynamics, became interested in the Judith Gap anomaly after Martinez presented her findings at a 1961 demographic research conference. Morrison's analysis of the census data revealed patterns that challenged conventional understanding of small community population stability. The missing 47 residents represented approximately 15% of the town's population, yet their absence had produced no observable effects on local institutions, businesses, or social structures. Morrison's field research in Judith Gap during 1962 involved extensive interviews with community members and detailed analysis of local records that might explain the census discrepancy. His investigation confirmed that the missing residents existed in all documented contexts except formal government enumeration. Property tax records, voter registration lists, and utility billing showed continued residence by people who could not be located during official population counts. School enrollment records included children whose families were absent from census data, yet these students attended classes regularly and were counted present by school administrators. The phenomenon repeated during the 1970 census, when enumerator Lisa Rodriguez documented exactly the same 47-person discrepancy that Chen had recorded 10 years earlier. Rodriguez's count showed 293 residents present for enumeration, while local records suggested a population of 340 people. The missing individuals included some of the same families that had been absent during the 1960 count, plus additional residents who had moved to Judith Gap during the intervening decade. Rodriguez noted that the 47-person discrepancy remained constant despite normal population changes due to births, deaths, and migration. The consistency of the 47-person shortfall across multiple census periods convinced Census Bureau administrators that the discrepancy represented systematic methodological problems rather than coincidental enumeration errors. However, attempts to identify the source of these problems proved unsuccessful. Independent verification teams sent to Judith Gap during 1980 and 1990 censuses confirmed the same population shortfall, yet could find no flaws in counting procedures or documentation that might explain the missing residents. The Census Bureau's internal investigation of the Judith Gap anomaly, conducted between 1992 and 1994, involved comprehensive analysis of enumeration procedures, interviewer training, and data processing methods that might contribute to systematic undercounting. The investigation found no technical or procedural issues that could account for the consistent 47-person discrepancy. Bureau statisticians noted that the missing population represented too large a percentage for normal counting errors, yet showed patterns that suggested systematic rather than random undercounting. Morrison's longitudinal research on the Judith Gap population, which continued through his retirement in 1995, documented the phenomenon's persistence across 4 consecutive census periods. His data showed that the same 47-person discrepancy occurred regardless of actual population changes, economic conditions, or seasonal factors that might affect resident availability for enumeration. Morrison's final report noted that the missing residents existed in all social and economic contexts, except formal government counting, suggesting a form of selective invisibility that defied sociological explanation. The Census Bureau's public response to inquiries about Judith Gap has remained consistent since the 1970s. Population discrepancies in small communities result from normal variations in enumeration procedures and do not affect the statistical validity of national census data. Bureau spokespersons indicate that minor undercounting in isolated rural areas is expected and accounted for through standard adjustment procedures. The agency maintains that the Judith Gap data meets all quality standards for census accuracy and requires no special investigation or methodology revision. Modern census procedures rely increasingly on electronic data collection and statistical sampling that reduce the importance of complete enumeration in small communities. The 2000 and 2010 censuses showed continued population discrepancies in Judith Gap, though the Bureau's shift toward electronic data processing has made detailed verification of local counting issues more difficult. Community members report that the same pattern continues. Residents who exist in all contexts except official government counts, maintaining their invisible presence in a town that refuses to reveal its true size when measured by federal authority. The 47 missing residents remain absent from official records while present in every aspect of daily life, creating a population that exists fully, except when the government attempts to count it. They shop at local stores, attend community events, and participate in the social fabric of Judith Gap while maintaining a collective invisibility that protects them from formal enumeration. The town continues to function as if all its residents are present, while the government continues to record a population that is always exactly 47 people smaller than the community knows itself to be. Some directions lead to places that refuse to exist. The Bear Paw Mountains rise from the northern Montana plains as an isolated cluster of peaks and ridges surrounded by vast expanses of prairie grassland. Located approximately 30 miles south of the Canadian border near the town of Chinook, the range represents the easternmost extension of the Rocky Mountain system before the continent surrenders to the Great Plains. The mountains reach a maximum elevation of 6,700 feet at Baldy Mountain, creating a distinctive landmark visible for over 100 miles across the surrounding flatlands. The Bear Paws have served as a navigational reference point for travelers crossing the northern plains since prehistoric times, when indigenous hunting parties used the peaks to orient themselves during buffalo migrations. The range's geological composition consists primarily of igneous intrusions and sedimentary formations that contain no significant magnetic minerals or metallic deposits. Geological surveys conducted during the late 19th century found small amounts of gold and copper in scattered locations, but no mining operations achieved commercial success due to the limited extent of ore deposits and the remote location. The mountains support mixed coniferous and deciduous forests on their slopes, with aspen groves, lodgepole pine, and Douglas fir, creating habitat for elk, deer, and black bears that draw hunters and wildlife observers from across the region. Indigenous peoples, primarily the Gros Ventre and Assiniboine tribes, have lived in the Bear Paw Mountains area for thousands of years, using the range as a source of game, shelter, and materials for tools and shelter construction. Tribal oral histories describe the mountains as a place of spiritual significance, though specific details about sacred sites or ceremonial areas are not widely shared with outsiders. The Bear Paws gained historical notoriety in 1877 as the site where Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce tribe made their final stand during their attempted flight to Canada, surrendering to U.S. Army forces just 40 miles short of the international border. The magnetic anomaly was first documented in September 1981 when U.S. Geological Survey geologist Robert Martinez was conducting routine mineral assessment surveys in the Bear Paw Mountains using compass-based navigation techniques. Martinez noticed that his compass consistently pointed to a bearing that differed significantly from magnetic north, showing a declination angle that suggested the presence of a substantial magnetic source somewhere in the surrounding terrain. Initial calculations indicated that the compass deviation corresponded to a specific location approximately 12 miles northwest of his position, in an area that geological maps showed as containing no unusual features. Martinez assumed his compass was malfunctioning and tested the instrument using standard calibration procedures, including comparison with backup compasses and GPS positioning equipment. All magnetic instruments showed identical declination patterns, consistently pointing toward the same coordinates, despite the absence of any known magnetic source at that location. Martinez's GPS readings confirmed that his position was accurate and that the target coordinates lay within a section of the Bear Paw Mountains that contained no documented geological anomalies, mining activities, or man-made structures that could explain the magnetic attraction. The phenomenon's consistency across multiple compass readings convinced Martinez that he had discovered a significant magnetic anomaly that warranted investigation. He hiked to the target coordinates over the following 2 days, expecting to find iron ore deposits, meteorite impact sites, or other geological features that could account for the strong magnetic field affecting compass readings throughout the region. Instead, Martinez found an unremarkable section of mountain forest containing typical soil, vegetation, and rock formations that showed no evidence of magnetic properties or unusual mineral content. Martinez conducted detailed magnetic field measurements at the target location using professional geological equipment, finding no magnetic anomalies or field variations that differed from normal background levels. Soil samples and rock specimens collected from the site showed typical mineral compositions for the Bear Paw Mountains region, with no iron content or magnetic materials that could influence compass readings. Most puzzling was Martinez's discovery that compasses continued to point toward the location even when he was standing at the exact coordinates, as if the magnetic source existed at the same place but remained undetectable by direct measurement. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geophysicist from Montana State University, joined Martinez's investigation after he reported the magnetic anomaly to the USGS regional office in Billings. Chen brought sophisticated magnetometer equipment designed to detect minute variations in magnetic field strength that might explain the compass deviation patterns. Her measurements confirmed that compasses throughout a 50-mile radius of the Bear Paw Mountains showed consistent declination toward the same coordinates, yet no magnetic field variations could be detected at the target location using sensitive electronic instruments. Chen's research expanded to include aerial magnetic surveys using aircraft-mounted magnetometers that could map magnetic field variations across large areas of terrain. The aerial surveys confirmed that compass declination patterns formed a perfect radial pattern centered on the mysterious coordinates, with magnetic deviation decreasing proportionally with distance from the target point. However, the surveys detected no magnetic field source at the center of this pattern, suggesting that compasses were responding to a magnetic influence that electronic detection equipment could not measure. The investigation attracted attention from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which sent researchers to verify the magnetic anomaly using calibrated compass instruments that served as reference standards for navigation equipment testing. The NIST team confirmed that compass declination patterns in the Bear Paw Mountains defied conventional understanding of magnetic navigation, showing consistent pointing behavior toward coordinates that contained no detectable magnetic source. Their report noted that the phenomenon represented a significant challenge to magnetic navigation principles used in surveying, aviation, and maritime operations. Dr. James Morrison, a physics professor from the University of Montana who specialized in electromagnetic phenomena, attempted to develop theoretical explanations for the Bear Paw Mountains magnetic anomaly. Morrison's analysis suggested that the compass behavior might result from unknown electromagnetic properties of the Earth's magnetic field in that specific location, possibly related to interactions between the planet's magnetic field and local geological structures. However, his theoretical models required magnetic field sources that were not detectable using any available measurement technology. Morrison's field research involved deploying arrays of sensitive magnetometers throughout the Bear Paw Mountains to map magnetic field variations with unprecedented precision. His measurements confirmed that the magnetic declination anomaly affected compass readings across a vast area, yet no corresponding magnetic field could be detected at any location within the affected region. Morrison's data suggested that compasses were responding to magnetic influences that operated according to unknown physical principles, pointing towards something that existed magnetically but not materially. The USGS conducted comprehensive geological surveys of the target coordinates between 1983 and 1987, using ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, and extensive drilling operations to search for subsurface features that might explain the magnetic anomaly. The surveys found typical Bear Paw Mountains geology, consisting of sedimentary rocks and igneous intrusions with no unusual magnetic properties. Core samples extracted from depths up to 200 feet showed normal mineral compositions and magnetic characteristics that could not account for the compass deviation patterns. Despite finding no physical explanation for the magnetic anomaly, the USGS continued monitoring the phenomenon through annual surveys that documented its persistence and stability over time. The compass declination patterns remained unchanged for over a decade, showing no correlation with seasonal variations, solar activity, or changes in the Earth's magnetic field that might explain the consistent pointing behavior. Survey reports noted that the anomaly represented one of the most puzzling magnetic phenomena ever documented, affecting navigation equipment across a vast area while defying detection by magnetic field measurement instruments. The investigation was quietly discontinued in 1992 when the USGS announced that budget constraints required the termination of specialized geological research projects that did not contribute directly to mineral resource assessment or hazard monitoring. Dr. Morrison's research funding was not renewed, and his request to continue monitoring the magnetic anomaly was denied by university administrators who noted that the phenomenon fell outside established physics research priorities. The accumulated data from over a decade of investigation was archived without publication or further analysis. Modern GPS navigation systems have largely eliminated the practical importance of compass navigation in the Bear Paw Mountains, though hikers and hunters who use traditional magnetic compasses continue to report the same declination patterns that Martinez first documented in 1981. Local outfitters and guides are aware of the compass anomaly and typically advise clients to rely on GPS equipment when navigating in the area. The phenomenon has become part of local folklore, though most residents consider it simply an interesting curiosity rather than a significant mystery. The coordinates that draw every compass needle within 50 miles remain unchanged, marked by nothing more than ordinary trees growing in unremarkable soil above typical mountain bedrock. No magnetic source has ever been detected at the location, no geological feature explains its influence, and no theory accounts for its persistent effect on navigation instruments. Yet compasses continue to point toward that empty place with mechanical precision, as if responding to something that exists in the language of magnetism but refuses to manifest in any form that human measurement can detect. Some rhythms beneath the earth refuse to follow geological time. The Yellowstone River Valley near Livingston, Montana, stretches between the Absaroka and Gallatin mountain ranges, creating a natural corridor that has channeled both water and human activity for thousands of years. The valley floor lies at approximately 4,500 feet elevation, bordered by peaks that exceed 10,000 feet, and carved by the Yellowstone River as it flows northward from Yellowstone National Park toward its eventual confluence with the Missouri River. The area sits within the northern extent of the Yellowstone volcanic system, though seismic activity has historically been minimal compared to the more geologically active regions surrounding Yellowstone Lake and the park's geyser basins. The geological foundation of the Livingston area consists primarily of sedimentary rocks deposited during ancient sea periods, overlaid by more recent volcanic deposits from Yellowstone eruptions that occurred hundreds of thousands of years ago. The region experiences typical mountain valley seismicity, with occasional minor earthquakes related to regional tectonic stress and thermal expansion associated with geothermal features located upstream in Yellowstone National Park. The Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology has monitored seismic activity in the valley since the 1950s, documenting earthquake patterns that follow predictable geological processes related to the Rocky Mountain fault systems. Historical records indicate that the Yellowstone River Valley has experienced several significant earthquakes, including the magnitude 7.3 Hebgen Lake earthquake in 1959 that caused substantial damage throughout southwestern Montana. However, the immediate Livingston area has remained relatively stable, with most recorded seismic events measuring below magnitude 3.0 and occurring at depths and frequencies consistent with normal tectonic activity. The valley's proximity to Yellowstone National Park makes it an important monitoring location for detecting volcanic activity that might affect the park's geothermal features or pose hazards to the millions of annual visitors. The seismic anomaly was first detected on June 18, 1987, when University of Montana graduate student Lisa Rodriguez was calibrating sensitive seismographic equipment installed near Livingston as part of a research project studying micro-earthquake patterns in the northern Yellowstone region. Rodriguez's equipment was designed to detect seismic events too small to be recorded by standard monitoring networks, capable of measuring ground movement at the nanometer level to identify subtle tectonic processes that might precede larger earthquakes or indicate changes in underground stress patterns. Rodriguez noticed unusual rhythmic patterns in her seismic data that appeared every 72 hours with mechanical precision, beginning at different times but maintaining consistent intervals between events. The seismic signatures resembled brief underground pulses rather than traditional earthquake activity, lasting approximately 15 minutes and showing frequency characteristics that differed from any known geological phenomena. The pulses originated from a depth of roughly 8 miles beneath the valley floor, too deep for human activity, yet too shallow and organized for typical deep crustal earthquakes. The regularity of the 72-hour cycle troubled Rodriguez more than the seismic signatures themselves. Natural earthquakes follow patterns related to tectonic stress accumulation and release, which typically occur over irregular timeframes ranging from seconds to centuries. The precise timing of the underground pulses suggested a mechanism that operated according to non-geological principles, maintaining a schedule that bore no relationship to known seismic processes, lunar cycles, or thermal variations that might affect underground rock stability. Rodriguez documented the phenomenon for 6 months before reporting her findings to Dr. Robert Chen, the University of Montana's seismology department head. Chen initially suspected equipment malfunction or data processing errors, but verification using additional seismometers confirmed Rodriguez's observations. The 72-hour pulse pattern appeared consistently across multiple monitoring stations positioned throughout the Yellowstone River Valley, ruling out localized instrument problems or interference from human activities such as mining or construction operations. Dr. Chen's investigation expanded to include historical review of seismic data collected by the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, searching for evidence that the pulse pattern might have existed prior to Rodriguez's discovery, but gone unnoticed due to less sensitive monitoring equipment. Chen found no historical records of similar seismic activity, though he noted that the government monitoring network used detection thresholds that might not have registered the subtle underground pulses that Rodriguez's equipment was designed to measure. The research attracted attention from Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geophysicist from the United States Geological Survey, who specialized in volcanic seismology and had extensive experience monitoring Yellowstone's geothermal systems. Martinez visited the University of Montana in February 1988 to examine Rodriguez's data and assess whether the seismic pulses might represent previously unknown volcanic processes related to the Yellowstone magma chamber or geothermal circulation patterns beneath the Northern Valley region. Martinez's analysis confirmed that the seismic signatures bore no resemblance to volcanic earthquakes, geothermal circulation, or any documented geological processes associated with the Yellowstone volcanic system. The pulse patterns showed characteristics suggesting organized underground activity that operated according to unknown physical principles, maintaining precise timing intervals that defied conventional understanding of seismic phenomena. Martinez noted that the depth and consistency of the pulses ruled out surface causes, while their regularity eliminated natural geological explanations. The University of Montana Seismology Department received federal funding in spring 1988 to conduct comprehensive monitoring of the seismic anomaly, deploying additional equipment throughout the Yellowstone River Valley to map the geographic extent and subsurface characteristics of the underground pulse activity. The expanded monitoring network confirmed that the pulses originated from a specific location beneath the valley floor and radiated outward in patterns that suggested a point source, rather than linear fault activity or broad crustal movement. Dr. Chen's research team documented the phenomenon for 3 years, accumulating data that showed the 72-hour cycle remained constant, regardless of seasonal variations, regional seismic activity, or changes in atmospheric pressure that might affect underground rock stability. The pulses occurred with clockwork precision, never varying by more than a few minutes from their expected timing and maintaining identical duration and frequency characteristics throughout the monitoring period. The team's attempts to correlate the pulse timing with external factors proved unsuccessful. The 72-hour cycle bore no relationship to lunar phases, solar activity, tidal forces, or any astronomical phenomena that might influence underground processes. Weather patterns, seasonal temperature changes, and regional earthquake activity showed no correlation with pulse timing or intensity. The underground activity appeared to operate according to its own internal schedule, independent of any external influences that might explain its mechanical regularity. Dr. Martinez's theoretical analysis of the accumulated data suggested that the seismic pulses represented a type of underground activity that challenged fundamental assumptions about geological processes. Her preliminary report noted that the pulse patterns required energy sources and organizational mechanisms that were not accounted for in current models of crustal dynamics, volcanic systems, or tectonic stress accumulation. Martinez recommended expanded research involving multiple universities and federal agencies to investigate the phenomenon's implications for seismic hazard assessment and geological theory. The research project was abruptly terminated in October 1990, when university administrators informed Dr. Chen that federal funding for the seismic monitoring project had been discontinued due to budget reallocations and shifting research priorities. Chen's request for continued funding through alternative sources was denied, and he was instructed to cease monitoring activities and transfer all accumulated data to an undisclosed federal facility for integration with national seismic research databases. Rodriguez's graduate research was redirected to conventional earthquake studies using data from other Montana locations, and she was required to sign confidentiality agreements regarding her work on the Yellowstone River Valley seismic anomaly. Dr. Chen's attempts to publish findings about the 72-hour pulse pattern were unsuccessful, with academic journals noting that the phenomenon fell outside established seismological research parameters and lacked sufficient theoretical framework for peer review. The accumulated data from 3 years of monitoring was transferred to federal custody and has not been made available for academic analysis. The University of Montana no longer maintains seismic monitoring equipment in the Yellowstone River Valley, and current earthquake detection networks operated by the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology use sensitivity thresholds that would not register the subtle underground pulses documented by Rodriguez's research. The official position of state and federal geological agencies is that no unusual seismic activity has been detected in the Livingston area, and that normal tectonic monitoring provides adequate earthquake hazard assessment for the region. Modern residents of the Yellowstone River Valley occasionally report feeling slight vibrations or hearing distant rumbling sounds that occur on regular schedules, though these reports are typically attributed to railroad activity, highway traffic, or agricultural equipment operation. Local folklore includes references to valley rhythms that old-timers claim to have noticed for decades, though no systematic documentation of these observations exists in government records or academic literature. Somewhere beneath the valley floor, 8 miles down in rock that has not seen sunlight for millions of years, the 72-hour cycle continues its mechanical precision, marking time according to purposes that follow no geological pattern and serve no natural function that human measurement can identify. The pulses rise through layers of sediment and stone with rhythmic certainty, as reliable as clockwork and as mysterious as the deep earth itself, counting down intervals towards something that remains forever undefined.